Hey everyone, I'm Rather Incoherent, and this is the Bloodborne City of the Unseen alpha test feedback video. I'm going to go through the book, the log, talk about all the problems I see as they come up. The one exception, I'm not going to talk about encounter sets during scenarios. I'll talk about the ones unique to that scenario, but all the universal encounter sets I'm going to put to the side and go through at once. First off, immediate feedback on what's my general impression of the campaign, how do I feel about it, should you play it? I had a great time with this campaign, I really enjoy it. I'm a huge fan of Bloodborne. It's literally my favorite video game of all time. So that probably warps my perspectives a little, but there are countless little things that are wonderful executions of mechanics in Bloodborne transformed into both flavor and mechanics in this game. Like the entirety of A Call Beyond is just a really clever boss fight from Bloodborne being turned into a different clever boss fight in Arkham Horror. And that's really cool. There are locations, I'll show off one in Hunt Begins. I'm not gonna show off all of them, there are too many little things like this to list them all, where the locations are really wonderful examples of mechanics in the game of Bloodborne turning into Arkham mechanics, and all of that really elevates the campaign a lot for me. Which means I can't really say if someone who hasn't played Bloodborne will have the same level of joy that I got out of this. But I think that's like par for the course with an adaptation campaign, right? Now, if you aren't a fan of alpha testing, I would say keep this on your radar and come back later. There are definitely a lot of little things, more so in the last half of the campaign. Makes sense, it's the newer half. And those little things could be a big problem for your group. There are scenarios that last far too long, many scenarios that last longer than they could, lots of little problems, little rules confusions. This is still at an alpha test stage, and if you don't want to do that, then I wouldn't tell you to do that. The campaign's not so amazing. I'll be like, oh, it's a finished campaign already. If you don't want to test things, you should still play it. It's really good though, and I would encourage you if you're on the fence to try it. And I would also encourage you to give feedback, because the more people who play it and test it and give feedback, the better the end product will eventually be. Because it's not just I'm gonna say what's wrong and tell you how to solve it. That's not what I think this video is. I'm gonna say how I think I would solve it. I'm gonna give suggestions, but at least like a good 25% of my suggestions will probably be dog shit. The important thing is that I'm saying I feel like X is a problem. And if there's a chorus of people saying X is a problem, then our suggestions on how to fix it, maybe those don't matter. But the fact that a problem has been identified, that does matter. So getting into the campaign, I'm gonna bring this over here like I would have it while I was playing. We're gonna start with the most obvious new rule, the insight token. It's like a bless or a curse token, except it starts in the bag. There are 3 of them, and every time you pull one, it's gonna remove from the bag. But instead of going to the token pool, it comes to the insight display. Once you have all 3 of these in the insight display, you're going to then mark one recognition. There's nowhere to mark it right now. You don't need to do this nonsense. I was just doing that for testing reasons, so I could say how much recognition and experience I got in every scenario. For me, I just marked it in here. You can mark it anywhere. This will eventually definitely be something where it's got a ticker like Chasing the Stranger or Vengeance, but right now this is like pretty bog standard with the second box having insight display written into it. This is just the thing you're given. It's a default basically, and it will be much more tuned to the campaign. It'll have the recognition tracker in the future. That's not like a suggestion that needs to be said. It's obvious. I think everyone knows this. A problem that does need to be addressed though involving this is a mechanical thing that might not yet be known. If you do want to put these in the insight display, you kind of can. If you put it on the insight display, you can't. If you put it over here, you can't. If you put it on the middle part, then you can drag and drop it. I'm not sure what the cause of that is. For us, the insight display is just the ground next to the bag. It's the fastest possible thing you can do. That's what you would do at a table. Essentially, the token pool just is the insight display. I'm not even sure the insight display necessarily needs to be a thing. Like, just if there are no insights left in the bag, which you would know to mean you pulled all 3. However it's done, it doesn't really matter. I'm just bringing up the mechanical issue of that. I like the idea of the insight mechanic and the recognition mechanic. The point of recognition, by the way, is that recognition is going to give you access to different story events and different like hard mode boss encounter type things. Now, I do have a super minor flavor gripe. The flavor on the whole has been nailed throughout this campaign, but while you do recognize what's going around you in the world with insight, in the game, you like consume Madman's knowledge to increase your level of insight, and that's what allows you to recognize the world. I think I would prefer if these were referred to as madness tokens and gave you an insight level instead of an insight level giving you recognition. Or sorry, insight tokens giving you a recognition level. That's a minor flavor thing, but it might be a thing that like the developer would agree with and just like got lost somewhere along the way. It's probably something they've already thought about and have a reason they disagree with me on though. Next mechanic, we have the Hunters of Yharnam set and the Spoils mechanic. The Hunters of Yharnam, let's go get them out. There's a million different sources for them because everyone comes with their own stack. There are a lot of campaigns that do this though. The Hunters of Yharnam are a group of Victory 0 enemies. When you go to a scenario that tells you to include them, you're going to shuffle all of them and put one in at random to the encounter set on turn 1. And what this does, there's also 2 cards called Polite Exchange that go in alongside them that have relation to them. I'll talk about them later. But when you kill these enemies, they go into the victory display, they never go back in. You don't put them back for the rest of the set, and they're dead for the rest of the campaign. Then you go to the spoils set, and you get an item related to them, in this case, the Salt Hunter badge. It's a cool mechanic, I like it. I'll talk about it more much later when I get through like going to universal encounter sets, because it very much is one. But on the whole, I really like it. It's a good way to add a bunch of random low-level bosses throughout the campaign, keep fighting to be more interesting, and drip feed some interesting story assets to the player. Swarming makes a return, so does Alert. I realized I never talked about this as a mechanic, and it's not mentioned in the front of the book, but it is one of the core identifying things about this campaign. It has what you would call boss phases. When the boss shows up, usually the same text that gives you that boss also instructs you to add several different cards to the set. They're all going to be tagged as attack cards. That's going to be their trait. They represent the boss directly attacking you, and you'll often be instructed to remove other cards. For instance, enemies that are no longer relevant to the current situation, that sort of stuff. So you have a much more attack-dense deck. And my opinion on this entire concept is that it's incredibly cool. It's a great way of showing off both the focus on bosses and the existence of boss phases that exist within Bloodborne. And conceptually, I really, really like it. But I had a problem that I show off a lot in my playthrough, and that is that if your team is really good at fighting, I don't draw any of those cards. I kill the boss in like 1 round, maybe 2. I really don't get to interact with this very much. So what I think I might like to see is some amount of redesign on many of the bosses to make it much more difficult to one-turn kill them. That's gonna fundamentally be like a huge amount of work to change. But at the very least, I will say this. I really like Lady Maria specifically. She does something that I think every boss should probably do, and it's her forced effect. At the end of the Mythos phase, discard cards in the top and counter deck until an attack treachery is revealed, resolve that card's relation effect. Now, this doesn't actually specify who does that. It would just be the lead investigator, I guess, which is terrifying. Good luck being the lead investigator. But I like that would mean you need a lead investigator take. I would like it if every single boss, agenda, or act had this forced effect and Lady Maria had something else, because then you'd be guaranteed to see more of the attack deck. And I know that makes them scarier, and I know my team that I played with was disproportionately good at fighting. But I think many teams will barely get to see this thing that a huge amount of work went into, and then it's one of the coolest things in the campaign. I never drew an encounter card after Maria showed up. I didn't. She died in 1 turn. And that can't be fixed without like huge reworks where you have like Haster mechanics from Carcosa in every scenario to limit how fast a boss can die. Increase the length of every scenario, increase the complexity of every scenario. I understand that can't be fixed. If a team is too good at fighting, they're too good at fighting. But I think the vast majority of teams will deal with the boss within 2 to 3 rounds and not get to see much of this deck. So I would like it if every boss had this forced effect, just stapled on the agenda, and I would actually like to see this included in the rules at the front of the book. It's a selling point of the scenarios of this campaign. I would include a little introduction on boss phases that gives a brief summary of like what the attack cards are, describes this force thing as a universal effect if you take my advice to change it, and then gives like a brief example of how they would work. Not necessarily like an actual gameplay example, but like you will often be told to remove enemies from the encounter set and add a set of attack cards, however you want to do it. But I would definitely include this in the sales pitch and in the new rules at the start of the book, because it really is, and I would endeavor to make sure that you actually get to see it if your team is really good at fighting. If they're too good after a certain point, there's nothing you can do, but I think you don't have to be that good at fighting to not see boss phases. Daniela basically soloed the boss of Scenario 2 on her own in I think 2 turns and 3-player difficulty. You really don't get to see as much of this set as I would like to, and that is a big criticism. Not because it's a thing where a set is bad, but because all of this is great and I want to see more of it, which isn't something the scenario is forced to happen right now. Now, there are 2 other mechanics that come back quite frequently in this campaign: barricades from Innsmouth and keys also from Innsmouth. Those will usually show up before any scenario they're in. Not always. Coming to the final scenario, for instance. Getting a bit ahead of myself here, but still, scenario setup starts here, and it ends there as well. Keys are not on this page, but keys are in the scenario, and there are no specific instructions given to you for getting keys in the scenario. It's definitely obviously that you use the standard keys rules, but it's a thing where we're in an alpha. I'll point it out each time we get to it, but there are some scenarios that lack rules they should have, or have somewhat contradictory rules that aren't clear, and I'll go through all that as we get to it. I'm not gonna make too much comment on the balance of the bag. I will say that this felt like a relatively soft bag throughout the campaign, with the occasional exception where a squid was pretty scary. But on the whole, I felt the bag was generally pretty soft. At least on standard, which I was playing on. And I should say this in the video, I don't know if I have yet. I've playtested the beginning 2 scenarios twice. My table hasn't finished the campaign, but I have finished it in 2-handed mode now. And 3-player, we're playing with double clover, which was a bad call for this campaign. It's very fight heavy, which is appropriate for Bloodborne, but we weren't really thinking about that at the time. Our 2-player group is Pure Fighter Daniela and then double clover Bob Jenkins, Ursula Downs. Most of my feedback will come from the 2-handed game that I played on the channel. I played as double flex, Parallel Skids lean towards fighting, and Diana Stanley lean towards clue finding. And they're both really good at fighting, so it really helped me. Just like, per capita, that team has some of the best fighting in the game, right? You have very few teams that function as a team that fight better as a whole than that team. And it definitely was like, almost to the point where I'd call it counterattacking the campaign to an unreasonable degree. And I didn't mean to do that. I just wanted to avoid the problem we had with Daniela and her double clover. And I didn't realize how much fight power I had. I was expecting Skids to be dead weight, and he just wasn't. Parallel Skids did so much better than I ever expected from him. But most of my feedback comes from that. Standard difficulty, 2-player, double flex, Skids and Diana. Before I go any further in the video, I'm going to briefly show these deck lists. I'm not going to talk about them anymore. I'll post links in the description so you can go and see all the different iterations of them. Both of these characters also cheat out experience, and this is already a very high experience campaign. So these decks have ungodly amounts of experience. This is what my Skids finish as, and this is where he started. Coming over to Diana, her deck is going to look a lot more similar at start and finish because it's a down the rabbit hole deck. Like, this is basically just the same list. It's basically just the same deck. There aren't that many changes, only 5 new cards. In a lower experience campaign, I'm not sure I'd have gotten divinations, but I needed Diana to get more clues than I realized she would. The deck Skids was really more just fighter Skids that happened to be able to get clues. He's very much in the Tony Morgan boat of fighters, where he's just like, I'm only fighting, I don't want to get clues, but like if you need me to, I can investigate at like 46 twice a turn for 1 clue each, and I do have 5 actions, so I'll make it happen. Now, let's talk just about the scenarios as much as I can. There's a lot of flavor text. This campaign came with a warning that has like as much flavor text as Edge of the Earth and Scarlet Keys and all of the new stuff like that. And that's not a bad thing, obviously, because like that's what the official campaigns are right now. But I played Edge of the Earth and Scarlet Keys a total of 4 times in the last month. I'm burnt the fuck out on text. Even though I am an English major, I would love to give you feedback on your text. I just can't do it. I can't read. I just want to play game. I did this in my playthrough too. Like, here's the core set, right? Here's the preface. Weird shit's happening. Here's the bag. Here's the story. Don't read any further. Page 2, we're already in resolutions. And it's not like unique to this campaign, right? Like, let's go grab Edge of the Earth's campaign guide. The first resolution's on page 12. There's more text than Edge of the Earth. So like, it's not heavy compared to what we're currently getting. How's Scarlet Keys looking, by the way? Scarlet Keys is looking weirdly tiny compared to Edge of the Earth for some reason. Resolution on page 7. They got better after Edge of the Earth, and I would say in terms of wordiness then that this is right between the 2 most recent campaigns. But for me, I just want to play game. I really don't want to read anymore. I'm burnt out, so I don't have feedback on all of this text. I would include a disclaimer in future playtest announcements, however, that it's a very fight-heavy campaign, because it most certainly is. And I think that's more important than acknowledging that it's a word-heavy campaign, because, like me, if it's a word-heavy campaign and you don't want to deal with it, you don't have to. I didn't read any of this. If it wasn't italics, I didn't look at it. So, with that out of the way, we're finally ready to start giving feedback on the game itself. It starts with a sleep. Each character has a dream. I'm not sure if they're all listed. I believe that there's a fail-safe line in case there isn't. I don't know what percentage actually is listed. There's 5 different dreams, and then you record which one each investigator had in your campaign log. So first, this should be at the front of it to avoid a very simple problem where everyone reads their dreams and then they get to the end and like, oh, all right, who had what dream? And they go back and they figure it out, find out the names, and they record it all. Easy problem to avoid, just move that text back. Second, these names aren't organized by anything, and maybe their color does indicate like the most common class, but this one's gray, so probably not. I would have these at least be alphabetized or something, because in my playthrough, it's edited out, but I found Skids O'Toole, looked for Diana, went back, read them all a second time, and then just to triple check before I did it, I read them a third time and realized that Diana is here somewhere. I keep missing her even now. My mouse is like right on her. Where is she? She's the second one. She's the second name. So if they were alphabetized, when you go back because you're doubting yourself, it would be better. But as you can see, Vincent, then Amanda, and it's not by class either because you have Red, then Red, and obviously everyone in the middle is not a survivor. So I would, minor thing, alphabetize those so players can be more immediately sure if they're missing their character or not. Then moving on, we have flavor text, and we eventually get to make a decision, are we adding a tablet or a cultist to the bag, based on whether or not we're naive or trusting. I don't actually know if this ever was referenced. Then again, I think like the exact same thing happens, including writing down unreferenced text at the start of Edge of the Earth. So I mean, if it's good enough for official campaigns, it's good enough for this one. The only reason I mentioned that is because coming over here to the actual version of the campaign log I had, you can see that I ran out of room. Going into scenario 7, I completely filled this with text, and that's even with combining lines like this one, where all 3 chords are in one line. I only did 1 quest, not all 6. So I would try to avoid anything where you have unnecessary records written down, because there's already just a lot of records. Anyway, we go through scenario 1 introduction, and then we get guidance cards. You might have seen my fighter skids and be like, why the hell doesn't your fighter skids have any weapons in it? It's because of these 6 cards. At the start of scenario 1, these 6 guidance cards are offered to you. Everyone has to pick one. And you start with them in play in scenario 1. In future scenarios, they're going to be in your deck. And Saw Cleaver is just big machete, so I immediately picked that as skids, because like, Parallel Skids doesn't get machete anymore. And big machete sounds great in a scenario with swarming, because it turns out this one isn't actually machete, it just is machete all the time. It doesn't care there are multiple enemies, or if you're not engaged with them and you're swinging over. It's a really good basic weapon. You've got the hunting pistol. This is really, really cool if you have a way of dealing with the soak, like if you're a Red character with Jessica Hyde. I was playing Daniela, and this thing has just felt amazing every time I used it on her. But if you don't have access to basic weapons, your fighter might prefer the Saw Cleaver. I will mention that the secondary action on this is, like, statistically almost never the right thing to do. It is rarely right, and I think the main thing this is meant to do is just be big machete, which it is. The Art of Quickening to me feels a little undertuned. There's a lot of health damage in this campaign. I'm pretty frequently scared of health damage in this campaign, and a -2 health malice is huge. Succeeding a foot test by 3 or more is not that bad because it's giving you +1 foot, so if you are triggering your cigarette cases, your lockpicks, all of your pickpocketings, all of that stuff without this, then you trigger this with it, and once a turn quick thinking is really strong. But like, this is really only useful for rogues that are already fully set up, and a 2 health malice is huge. So I think this could easily be reduced to a 1 health malice or even just straight out no health malice. The Lumen Flower Keepsake is a hand slot +1 head asset, making it a good thing for mystics if you don't want the Cyclopean Hammer. Unfortunately, my Cyclopean Hammer made it underperform pretty severely, as it usually got thrown right in the trash because my hands were full. But it does have a reaction ability to ward of protection, so like, yeah, it's really obviously transparently good, and it's a big argument for a Mystic in this campaign to not take Cyclopean Hammer, which is always something I like to see, and it gives you a clear idea. These cards are supposed to be strong. Better Machete is okay. Potentially using a 3 damage weapon every round forever if you can do the Health Soak is okay, and that's why Art of Quickening feels so much weaker, because like you see these 4 cards and then Art of Quickening and Madness and all just aren't on the same level. Gatekeeper's Messenger has a lot of text. It's essentially a really janky Out of Crossroads from Scarlet Keys. You reveal the top 3 of your deck, you draw 1, discard 1, attach 1 to messengers and attach messengers to your location. Then any other investigator can lightning bolt the messengers, and they'll pick up the card the messengers had, which then shuffles the messengers back into its original deck. So you're gonna draw a lot of extra cards off of this, and also maybe break the game in half just a little bit. But it's fun, I like it, it's not an official campaign, you don't have to worry about the rules, and this only breaks 1 campaign at most, the one it's in. So yeah, on the whole, I really like Gatekeeper's Messengers. And again, like Lumen Flower, it makes it clear how strong all this stuff is supposed to be, which is why Art of Quickening feels undertuned. It's by comparison. Madman's Knowledge is a next slot book boost with -1 sanity, and it's sort of like, well, it's a skull itself, it's sort of like the decorated skull from Forgotten Age, right? You get charges every time you draw an insight token instead of killing a guy, and you can spend up to 3 to draw that many cards. My opinion on this is that this is basically a next slot +1 book. This is just bad St. Hubert's Key. You might get 1 deep knowledge per scenario out of this. It's really not that good. Pretty much every class has a great use for their next slot. Rogues have cigarette cases, Mystics have St. Hubert's Key, and they don't want this to begin with. Seekers have Eon charts and off-class options. Guardians don't really care about this effect, and Survivors are like seemingly the most likely to want this. I think like the most likely place this goes is in a Daryl Simmons or some other book-based Survivor Clover. But on the whole, it's just not a very good card. With like the Hunting Pistol, if you don't synergize with it, it's still hitting for 3. It's still a big deal. But with Madman's Knowledge, there's just a huge amount of characters that aren't going to run this. Like, if it were a 0 experience card in the set, they wouldn't pick this. And that's the same thing with Art of Quickening. That's the difference. These are cards that you would put in 0 experience decks if you had the option and think they were really broken, and these aren't. Which is why I feel like they are notably weaker. And it's also why Madman's Knowledge has never seen play at a table I'm at. Now, proceeding on, the next thing that happens is set up, we pull our encounter sets, put things down, we get barricade rules, and I really like this. The thing that isn't the same from other sets that use barricades, the Innsmouth stuff, has been bolded. If an hunter enemy tries to move and there is no path, instead of just ignoring them, they cancel the movement and remove a barricade between its location and its intended destination. Really happy this is bolded. I'm pretty confident, however, that this rule is used every time barricades show up. Because barricades show up in multiple scenarios, and this, I would like to see barricades at the front of the book. I know it adds more text to an already long rules section, but it's better to add that there than have it multiple times on multiple different scenarios. And people are checking to see if there's any different rules or if it's the exact same text as last time. And then we're ready to play. And I first want to compliment this a lot. I've already done Act 1 setup, but you're going to see that as I do Act 2 setup, obviously this should be moved down a little bit. And these should also snap into the little slots that are here for other campaigns. I don't know. Oh, are they just too high? Is that the issue? They're just too high. Yeah. Move them down a little bit so they snap correctly, and then place these in the Arkham Horror section. But the thing I really dislike about their current positions, I'm going to have to Control Z after I do this because it's going to explode. Whenever I play a scenario, I always tap it with E, I rotate it so that it's like obvious which ones I played. They all clip into each other a little bit. It was okay this time. I've seen one of the boxes outright eat another box. I've seen one flip and shoot off the table. This time it was calm. It sort of just hurts my soul a little bit that it does this. Whereas like this, where they're snapped where they're supposed to be, you press E on them, nothing bad happens. Anyway, the first thing I want to comment, I guess, about is the Act 2 randomized decks. I need to do that before I get into the scenario itself properly. You choose a deck at random, and all that changes with this is when you go over to Act 2, you get a different person, and there are different story ramifications of this. I'm going to jump ahead to these decisions and talk about them now. The mechanical ramifications of this, however, are that if you save Viola, you get a skull, and if you save Gilbert, you transform a different symbol into a squid. Now, in this campaign, tablets are pretty damn bad a lot of the time, so changing one into a squid is honestly not that big of a deal. In addition, cultists are also pretty damn bad a lot of the time, so changing one into a squid is not a big deal, and you'll notice that coming over to the Chaos bag, there's initially only one of each of these. So, if at the start you make the choice that adds a cultist or a tablet, and then you're given this choice, what you're able to do is turn your only cultist into a squid, or your only tablet into a squid, and you actually have more certainty about what you'll draw from the bag. So since those aren't that much weaker than the squids in this campaign, I actually think an additional skull was not that much softer. There's more certainty in the bag with this, so you know a tablet or his cultist isn't there. But that said, I would play with a bag of 100 skulls and one autofill every day, add as many skulls as you like. Like, as a new player, this looks immediately much softer and feels kind of bad to find out that you randomly rolled a squid instead of a skull. And in addition, just every token in the bag that isn't the autofill makes the bag better. And the reason I harp on this is because the decision isn't a decision, it's out of your hands. One of them is done if you succeed, the other one never happens. Now, coming back to this to talk about it, we need to place down some more act locations. I want to talk about how much I love this. Each time you place down new locations, or progress the act rather, you just get more locations. The map just gets bigger, there's more stuff to do each time. I really, really like it. Now, I'm going to recall these because we're going to talk about something that's a little bit wrong with them in a second. We will be needing Act 3 though. Down here, you can see you have a random location. You start in the sick room, and then you have a random location here. And if you look at them, one has you a chance of acquiring a tincture of ether, one of bandages. That's what you need to save these people. If you acquired bandages, you save her. And on this guy, if you acquired a tincture of ether, you save him. So this location that you start next to can make you do a test. These tests are not symmetrical, by the way. A book test is much easier if you're investigating at 4 than a foot test is. Most characters are going to be doing these as the same thing. These are almost never the same on any character. So this is a harder location generally. But either way, you do a 4 test pretty much at the start of the scenario to get this stuff. And you assume it's important because it's here. But if you come up here, because like if that was the only way to do it, there'd be a 50% chance of locking, you'll find there are lightning bolt locations. And you have acquired a tincture of ether, there's no clues here. And you have acquired bandage, that there's no clues here. And I don't know why this one doesn't get clues. A lot of the time in this scenario, there are little locations where they don't get clues. or there are locations where you need to regenerate them to get them to spawn with clues, and for some reason they don't initially. That's all mechanical nonsense. That's a problem that's immediately known in every playtest. I'm not going to point it out every time it happens, but it's just a thing that happens a lot in this campaign. Additionally, you'll notice that this is one way and that's another way, and this is another thing that happens a lot with campaigns still in testing. When you rotate a card, it's only for one card. I'm not sure how you fix that. I feel like it happens less in Dream Eaters, but maybe I'm going crazy and it's just what happens with cards on the back. I don't know. But the point we need to get back to is a lightning bolt for doing a victory location is something that you want to do. And it makes this test you did originally irrelevant. Essentially, this is a random chance to not need to go get a victory point. And like, it's actually way harder. Doing the test is not as easy as a lightning bolt. So I think these locations just need a full redesign. This should be something else. I don't like what these give you in any way. It feels pointless and random. If you get this and then find out you're getting the victory anyway, you wasted your action. If you get this and it's not your half of the campaign, then like, why do you even get it? What was the point? And on a blind playthrough, you don't know this, so you think it's important and you just waste your time. Now, beyond that, both decks are the same, but there's one more thing to mention. Both of these people at the bottom say proceed to Act 4C, Viola's Wish, or A Fellow Outsider. That is a typo. That should be Act 3A and 3C, and in addition, that shouldn't even be there. You get this character by flipping this over. Act 3 is in play. You don't even need that text. So it is both a typo and redundant and unnecessary. So rather than fixing the typo, just cut that entirely. And since I'm doing act criticisms right now, going over to 1B, you'll notice that on the back of Act 1B, second paragraph at the bottom, shuffle each copy of Elderly Huntsman Gleeful Atrocities in the encounter set along with the Quite Thrilling and Beast encounter sets. If you ever do stuff on the back of an encounter card like this happens a few times in the campaign, and in every time I have the same criticism, please include the encounter set icons. Otherwise, we have to reference the book and go back and forth. And the answer, by the way, with the set of side cards is all 17 of them go in. There are no unnecessary ones. But in my first playthrough, I went through and checked every single one of them. Does this have the grabby hand? Does this have the other icon? Does this happen to be the specific cards? What is it? Elderly Huntsman and Gleeful Atrocities? And then put them all in. By including the icons, you make it a lot faster. You're not constantly checking the book and trying to figure out what things are. The less you have to reference outside of the cards, the better, and including the icons fixes that. Now, everything else is basically the same, so we're going to start imagining we're playing the Gilbert version of the scenario, and put this where it goes. Now, looking at the first floor sick room, I like this location exists because it avoids hard locking the scenario. Because one of the scenario cards can drop barricades, and that means you might need to get more clues to get rid of barricades. The reason this is very important is because you're eventually going to get to Hospital Courtyard, spend your clues, and advance to Act 2, which places new locations, but also gets rid of the sick room. So now you need a new location to avoid that soft lock. Sorry, not a soft lock, a hard lock. And you'll see that none of these locations actually give you anything to avoid that hard lock. So something somewhere needs to change to make sure that players can't accidentally hard lock themselves out of success by just getting repeated barrier rolls and failing. Additionally, in Act 2 setup, this is going to be pointing upwards as though this is a one-way trip, but red square connects to plus and plus connects to red square, so this should just be that. In my playthrough, maybe I'm an idiot, maybe something went horribly wrong, but I thought it was just the other way around. I don't know why I thought that. According to this, it should just be a straight path, which does make more sense on the map because the fact this was one way never mattered at all. A quick thing I want to say that I'm happy is done well. Victory locations on both versions when you have randomized locations, always very happy to see it. And one last thing before we go forward, I'm not 100% sure what the trigger is. I think it might be having Saw Cleaver out on its own, not in a deck. But in both my playthrough on the channel and with my other group, for some reason, City Center Plaza didn't leave Act 2 setup, and instead it put down a Saw Cleaver face down, which it ripped off of someone's board. Also, that glitch may be related to the one empty thing that is in the Act 2 bag. Not sure what that's about. Okay. I just finished updating all of my notes for everything I've just said so I can give a text version of this to the creators as well. I want to talk about Ominous Spire. It's a location that's a really good example of something that happens constantly in this campaign. This is a good thing, I'm not criticizing. They do so many little things that are wonderful methods of converting the events and Bloodborne, the video game, into mechanics that accurately represent that in Arkham Horror, the LCG. This location on the right is perfectly fine at doing that. If blood-drunk enemies spawn, they go here instead, and then they all give this +1 shroud, and some of them, most of them actually are swarming, so you need to deal with them to investigate here. That's all really, really good. That really does, because of the +1 shroud and swarming enemies, it's really good at it too. Because this area in the video game, there's just a ton of guys. There's like a double-digit number of guys, and any one of them can 1v1 you if you're bad at the game. And then coming over to the other version of Ominous Pyre, which is potentially more problematic for a player. As an additional cost to investigate, you must test foot 3. If you fail, either draw the top card of the encounter deck or immediately move to a connecting location. And this is representing the same thing very differently. You're testing foot to dodge all those guys, and if you fail, something bad happens to the encounter deck, or you run away. Like, this feels bad as a player. It's supposed to. It's a victory location. It's hard to deal with. But it's a great representation of stuff in the game turning into Arkham horror mechanics, and it's like that for most of the mechanics, I feel like. And where it's not representing accurately, I often feel like that's a choice by the developer because they'd prefer it to represent more threatening than it was in the game. I do want to point out, I'm not sure if this is the intention of the card. Once you initiate the test, you're going to take the test. So even if you fail this foot test and move to a connecting location, you still get to look for the clues. That's my understanding of the rules. If that's what's supposed to happen according to the card, then cool, we're kosher. But if it's not, then I would want to point out that it's not quite doing what the developers intended. Actually, thinking about it, I would suggest you have Ominous Pyre be changed. Have it be forced after you investigate this location. Because drawing the encounter card will never really affect your ability to investigate, because you won't trigger an opportunity attacks you already paid the action cost. And additionally, moving, as the rules currently work, doesn't stop you either. So by having this be changed to after, all that really does is make sure that people who are getting the rules wrong don't. Because if you're doing it after, there's going to be no confusion about whether or not you are able to investigate and get the clues or whether or not you get attacked. I would change this to be not an additional cost, but after you perform the test. And one more thing that happens constantly in custom campaigns is sometimes there's just too much text on a place. Look at this. Look at the little ant text. I've got it zoomed in so far. This is like the normal size a card's at. So here's my question. If a card has this much text, what is it adding? I can test Fist at this location. If I succeed by 2, then I get to resolve a Hunter keyword and make him come over to me. Or if I fail a foot test here, I have to. Like, that Fist test is so niche. I think I would just be completely fine to have this just be a bad location. Like, there's a lot of text that matters in these games, and a big part of refining is stripping out text that really doesn't improve the scenario. And I personally would look at City Center Plaza and be like, that first ability just doesn't need to be there. I don't see it getting used very often at all. In 2 playthroughs now, I haven't seen it be used a single time. It's very, very likely not going to have an effect. And the more you reduce the mental load, the smoother the game plays. And that criticism is going to come up a lot more in later scenarios. This first one's relatively good about this sort of thing. Now, something I haven't mentioned at all until just now, the agenda decks. All of them have this text. When enemies move during the Hunter phase and when they attack, they're basically doing the stuff from War of the Outer Gods. They're moving towards each other and they're attacking each other. They're just as important as investigators. I think Outer Gods goes one further and makes them ignore investigators if there are enemies available, or maybe they're just all aloof. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, point being, really cool. Love the Beast and Blood Drunk enemies fighting each other. And really appropriately to the story, the effect of this, a lot of cards search out Blood Drunk enemies, but none of them search out Beast. So you as the player kill most of the Blood Drunk enemies and only Beast are left. You're essentially making everything a lot worse by getting into a fight with the Blood Drunk guys. Now, I do want to mention a small criticism here that is actually somewhat important. Beast and Blood Drunk are ordered one way for movement and the other way for fighting. That has no effect and will only serve to confuse players. Just have it be the same both ways. Doesn't really matter. Like, there might be a goal you're pushing for, like Cleric Beast dying to them, so you'd want Blood Drunk to go first, which is how it currently works. But if that's the case, whichever one should go first in the attack step should also go first in the move step. And one last thing while we're talking about this already, let's come over to a card you add during Act 2. It is the Elderly Huntsman. When you do the Hunt Begin stuff and everyone attacks each other, the ready enemies deal their damage. If they aren't doing the attack step, they don't exhaust. Meaning that the Elderly Huntsman, since he will still be ready, is going to shoot you, as well as fight. I'm not sure if that's intentional. I'm not sure of a quick way to fix that. I personally think this is just like a weird rules quirk that if you're like know how the game works, you realize it happens and you laugh and it's fine. And like mechanically, that actually works. So the Elderly Huntsmans like have flamethrowers and pistols. It makes sense that they could really fuck up a wolf and then shoot you too. But I'm not sure it's the intention, and if it isn't, I won't bring attention to that interaction. Now, coming into the last part of these scenarios, we're going to be doing the Act 3 setup. We already know this one. These come down. It broke a little bit because I was messing with it. It's fine. That's not any fault of the scenario. We already know what this is. You go up here, you get the stuff, you come back to the City Center Plaza, which is where your Act 2 guy will be hanging out. You give him the ether, and it drops in the Act 3 stuff. Now, slight problem, this does need to be noted. When you flip over to Act 3, right? If it's Agenda 1 or 2, then you put the set aside atop the Great Bridge location to play and spawn the set aside Cleric Beast at that location. That's perfectly fine. There's not an Agenda 1 or 2 bag, there's just an Agenda 3 location bag. When you flip to Agenda 3, if you're going slow, like I was on my channel, you'll see if it's Act 1, 2, or 3, put the Great Bridge location into play. Now, you can find Cleric Beast easy peasy, but the Great Bridge is in the Act 4 bag. So that does need to be changed. Because as it stands, it feels a little bit bad to be told your tempo is so horrifically shit that the developers didn't even plan around you being this slow. That's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in Arkham Horror. But yes, this needs to be in a different bag because it could be Agenda or Act that causes it to advance. So even though the setup bag is really nice, this does just need to be a set-aside location alongside the Cleric Beast. Now, at this point, we've seen the whole scenario. This would be in. We're in the final acts and Agenda. How do I feel about like the general flow of the scenario? I absolutely love it. Just getting progressively more map, keep going into the locations, you get victory locations up here. And this is one of the best things I've ever seen. Normally, you get a victory to enemy and a victory to alternate condition. And you're like, go clear the resign location, kill the enemy 2, twice as much victory, easy peasy. This full clear is 11 experience. Overarching criticism of the campaign, there is too much experience. Coming up here, like you saw those decks, those were Dream Eaters numbers, and 12 experience and 12 experience back to back in session 3 and session 4, 8, 7, 6, 6, and 7 in the others. Like, we got huge amounts of experience. Like, absolutely massive amounts of experience. So, on the one hand, the experience here does need to be toned down a little bit, and that's true pretty much across the board, across the campaign, and I won't be mentioning it going forward, because just like, you saw those final decks, they weren't okay. You should not be getting Dream Eaters experience in 8-player campaigns, or 8-session campaigns rather, 8-scenario campaigns. But, despite that criticism, I think this one's completely fine. This is a huge shot in the arm of experience up there with like Ice and Death Part 1 at the start of the campaign. And that's also an 8-experience campaign. But this isn't really an 11-experience campaign. These could do to not be victory locations. That would be fine, you could cut victory somewhere else. But you can't actually do these unless you're just completely demolishing the scenario. To go this way, you have to clear out these barricades with clues. You have to clear out a 4-shroud 2-player clue location and then a 2-shroud 6-player clue location. And the really hard part is this narrow alleyway. No more than one investigator may occupy this at a time. I would actually think that might need to be adjusted for player scaling. I can't comment. In both 2 and 3-player it felt alright, but in 4-player it might not be okay. But I really like it. I like the idea, even thematically, that if you want to escape and there's 4 of you, you fucking can't. You don't fit down the tunnel. He's gonna catch you. And it doesn't necessarily stop you from designing, right? Because you don't need to. You can have one guy clear this barricade, then someone else walk in with all the clues, clear these 2, and walk to the next, and you all just run in one at a time. You don't have to get the victory here, but doing it's very, very hard in 4-player, and I think that's fine. But generally speaking, because this is so hard to get out, and this is a boss that's gonna be killing you and making you be time pressured and try to leave quickly, these aren't really both attainable. This might be 11 max, but it's really 9 max. You should never be so far ahead that you can get 11. So that's really it for all the things that stood out to me so far about how this played that need to have their attention drawn to them. If you want to see me having fun and playing it and like my live reactions, that's obviously there. But I don't think anything like deserves to be in a feedback video beyond what I've talked about. But I do need to talk about the encounter deck, wherever I've put that. I might have to get a new one. Is it in here? No, that was the weird empty thing. Yeah, I just fully deleted it. 1 second, let me get a new one. In Act 2 of the scenario, you're looking at a 33-card encounter deck. I should mention, the initial encounter deck is only 15 cards. That's a little bit on the slim side. In a 4-player group, you're going to see all of that very quickly, and you're probably all going to light on fire pretty much instantly. There are 3 copies of Uncontrollable Fire, and you might want some more encounter cards in the initial deck, just like probably a head test of some sort. Throw in a Rotting Remains variant. 15 is a little bit too on the slim side, and that feels a little bit bad. Especially getting into this. There's a reason I suggested a head test as what should be in there. So we have a 33-card encounter set. In the middle, we have our enemies. How many enemies do we have? We have 14. It's almost 50%. It's some of the highest enemy density in any Arkham, but you shuffle it in. You don't include the encounter discard pile. I like that. I like it in Ice and Death Part 1. I like it here. But it means there's a very good chance you've seen like 10 cards, and then you shuffle in the new stuff, which includes all 14 of these enemies. 13. One of the Scourge pieces already in the discard pile. So you add like 13 enemies and then a couple other cards to a deck of 4 cards. And the density during that phase is tremendously above half the deck. So this is a very fight heavy. As a campaign, that's generally true, and it's very true in these first two scenarios. Then we have 5 cards up here that I would call other treacheries, not foot or head treacheries. This one's both, that's why it's in the other category. This is just an effect. I love Slake the Thirst. In fact, I think it's one of my favorite cards in the entire set. I like Dreadful Effigy as a one-of. This would be very dangerous if there were multiple copies of it. But it's like less than Ancient Evils in a lot of ways. You're gonna spend money to get rid of it. It's nice to have resources be a solution to an agenda card every now and then. So on the whole, I like this, but there are 5 cards I would call other cards. Then we have our foot test treacheries. We have Lethal Atrocities to summon an enemy, Fuhaloo to summon an enemy. Noticing that our enemy density is a little bit higher when these cards are just actually summon an enemy, and Uncontrolled Fire, foot test to not take damage by getting rid of the card. It goes away permanently. But all of this qualifies as foot test or enemies. How many of that? 21 out of 33. We have 12 cards left. 5 of them are other. They're not necessarily head test, which leaves us with what you would think are 7 head treacheries, only they're not really. This is test 3 head, and if you fail, nothing happens. Gaining Prey U on some enemies, like on the fighter, this card doesn't even exist, you're happy to hear it. And that's kind of the point. But a double action to get rid of it on most characters isn't worth it, because like, what's it gonna cause? Your fighter has to spend an engage action, you're the Kluver, you're more important. He can get rid of it for you if he wants to, but you're not doing it. Then we have Blood Drunk, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. Where this, your fighter gets it, he doesn't care at all, and your Kluver gets it, he probably doesn't care. On this one, if your Kluver gets it, nothing happens. Like, literally nothing. If your fighter gets it, we get into a weird place. I think Blood Drunk is in need of at least the following text. Limit this to a one of. You can't have 2, because if you get -4 fists as a fighter, you just stop doing your job. And it's possible through RNG or just the character you picked in the order of your draw that you can't pass this Rotting Remains test at the end. You can't beat the 3 head, you're frozen in fear, and you're just unable, like literally unable to do your job in any capacity because of having 2 of these. But this is a head test, for fighters only. This is a head test that doesn't matter, and this is a head test that gets rid of a foot penalty, which only matters because of the foot treacheries. There's not actually a single straight up head test in this deck. And because you have that initial really small deck, and then this tremendous emphasis on fighting and foot test, it feels like it's to the detriment. Like if you put some actual straight up head test in that first deck, it would really smooth out the encounter. And I'll cover all of these cards in a lot more detail. I was starting to go off topic and talk about Blood Drunk, and I'm gonna save that for later. Before I move on to scenario 2, I looked into this. The only unique set in this scenario is the Crescent Moon here. The only card in that set is Uncontrolled Fire. It's not actually a named set. So I think what's happening is that's just an unfinished The Hunt Begins set, and there's gonna be another head test in this set in any final build. I think they're already fully on board with all the criticisms I just gave, but to give my opinion on Uncontrolled Fire, in a 15 card encounter deck, this is terrifying. What if like all 3 of you draw this? This isn't like limited to 1 location or anything, it's absolutely terrifying. And in the start, all 3 locations are connected, so you can't just run away from it. You have to get 4 clues and advance the act before you can actually just avoid this and not do the foot 3 test to deal with it, which in a lot of teams is very hard. Like, short of 5-foot rogues, no one can really easily check that. I think this is a prime target for early game Ward of Protection or Promise of Power. This thing is a terrifying card, but it doesn't feel overpowered. It's just that there are 3 of them in a 15 card deck, and in a 3 location map that's fully interconnected. At the very start, they're pretty spooky. Moving on to scenario 2, Fear the Old Blood. The first thing I want to bring attention to is in the map, you see this, where you can see free movement here, but only one-way movement in all of these directions. This is because the players start here and they can move freely here, but these 3 locations are enemies only. So enemies freely move over here, but these are all one way. This being on the map would be perfectly fine, but instead it starts like this. This is just a setup thing. Those just need to be changed to this. And I imagine the developer knows this one. Any setup thing like this is really minor feedback, but I need to say it just in case. An additional setup thing. It didn't happen this time. I don't know what does cause it. Likely related to the same glitch we saw in Act 2 setup over here. When I was playing this off the channel with my friends, I had to make a new copy of Bloodborne because we couldn't even find Jura. He was an Art of Quickening for some reason. Going into scenario 2, I want to go through the encounter cards you need to hit first. I think that's a better place to start instead of doing it last. And holy shit, this one's the complete opposite. There are 31 unique encounter cards. I don't believe these ever show up again in the campaign, and Baptism of Fire set is just the one for the scenario. So let's go talk about all of this. We're going to start with the smaller set, the one that's only 10 cards. Blood Sacrifice is a card that I don't like at all, and it's because of the words, if you're Investigator. If that were reaction, and then when you deal 2 or more damage to an enemy in a single action, discard Blood Sacrifice, it'd be fine, because your fighter could do it for you. But you have to do it. There are a lot of Kluvers that literally just cannot do this. My job is to get clues. I can't do that. That's not a thing in my deck. And for those Kluvers, this just says permanently take 1 extra damage every time you take damage. This is a terrifying card, and on fighters, it's like the softest card in the world. There's so much fighting in this scenario that it just goes away instantly. So I understand that if fighters could get rid of this for their Kluvers, it would do nothing on everyone, basically. But in this scenario specifically, your Kluver's very oftentimes not at the location your fighter's at. Your fighter's just off fighting a massive dude, alone, one-on-one. You're very frequently not going to be able to walk over to the fighter and ask for help. Since I stopped myself on Blood Drunk, this scenario-specific card, the first time I mentioned this, there seem to be a lot of cards in these sets with really high variance, where they might do nothing, or they might be crippling, depending on who draws them and when. And I mean like literally nothing and absolutely terrifying, as far apart on the spectrum as you can get. And Blood Sacrifice, I don't like for that. Because if they're that polarized, then they're very, very random. And you're going to get this a lot from me throughout this campaign, and even in this set as we continue on, I don't like random. Now, a Blood Drenched Fate is actually a card I'm completely fine with. This is a card that says damage and horror cannot be healed from you or your assets, which is very, very scary, but you can just throw away an asset to get rid of it. This is a really brutal crypt shield if you need to be healed. It's a crypt shield that you didn't roll for, and it cost you an action. But a lot of the times you don't need to be healed, and this does nothing. I actually am perfectly fine with the spaces and habits, but I will say take 2 damage so that you can be healed is like an oxymoron. Like, you can't actually take damage so people can heal your damage. That doesn't work. So I don't necessarily like this little line of text. I think without this, I would actually like the card more, even though it just makes the card harsher. Then we have this pair of cards, a Mirror Bad Dream and Into Temptation. They are clearly Rotting Remains and Grasping Hands variants, but instead of taking degrees of damage, you just take 2 all the time. That's fine, just give them some extra text to spice them up a bit. But the extra text is they randomly gain Surge. Like, it doesn't even matter if you pass, they just randomly gain Surge some percentage of the time. The reason I don't like playing on hard mode is because these tokens say X happens on hard, but on fail, they say if you fail, X happens. So a decision point goes away on hard. You're no longer thinking about that threshold in the same way. It's just a math-based chance of success, not a specific % chance of this thing happening that you can then negate by over-succeeding. So with these, if they told me if you draw those on a failure, they gain Surge, I would think they were really spooky, but I would like them. But because it just happens no matter what, it's random amounts of Surge in the deck, and I hate that. Now, let's move on to the set that makes up the bulk of the scenario, the church and the people attacking it. I want to start with Penitence, because it is the only head test in the entire set, and there are 30-ish cards that are unique to the set in addition to other encounter sets. So once again, in Scenario 2, there's almost no head test, and that feels bad. This is a head test for taking damage, which is always spooky, but completely fine. I'm perfectly fine with this card in its current state. I will notice a criticism here that comes up a lot in this campaign. This card just sort of randomly has Peril. I feel like a huge numbers of cards in this campaign have Peril, and to a lesser degree, more in the second half of the campaign, also Surge. But I will start pointing it out every time I talk about a card with Peril or Surge, and I do want to note that as a player, I felt there were a weirdly large number of cards with Peril and Surge in this campaign. Now, head tests to take up to 3 damage depending on the discard pile of contents, that's totally fine, but I do need to make a note. You discard cards on the top of the encounter deck until an enemy is revealed. We're not revealing cards, we're discarding cards. So for the card to work the way I'm sure it's supposed to work, you discard the enemy. It should be until an enemy is discarded. I really, really like the heal 1 horror and then gain Surge. Like, heal 1 horror doesn't need to be there, but flavorfully it works so well. I love that. Now, getting into the rest of the set, these are our foot tests, these are our enemies, and this is my other stuff. This other stuff is actually enemies though, because this just spawns an enemy, either with you or with a bystander, and your goal here is to protect bystanders, and if somehow there are literally no enemies anywhere, then this gains Surge. And that will happen in the final phase, you'll see how later. So this is really just an enemy card that mixes up where the enemies are spawning, because normally they just spawn in these graveyards and they come at you and you're placing barricades yourself to hold out. It's tower defense. It's a really good iteration of tower defense, and I like it more than Dogs of War, but it does have a couple of problems that we'll get into later. Abandon Faith you might think is a head test, but you can just do that first option and put a Doom on Sister Amelia, which is at worst lose 1 action, instead of gambling to place 4 Doom instead, 3 Doom, because one of those bystanders is also a blood state. Like, you just don't need to do the head test here. Even if you have like 6 head, there's a -4, there's an auto fail. It's just an action, just pick the other option, don't risk it. Like, this isn't actually a head test. Then coming over to the foot test, Baptism of Fire is pretty soft. You test 3 foot, and if you succeed, nothing even happens. But if you failed, you remove all barricades from a location. No location with barricades? Alright, cool. Instead, go ahead and just attach this, and now you can't put barricades there. In addition to not getting to place barricades there, you also take a damage when you enter that location. And also really cool is you spend any combination of player resources or clues to discard it, which is a really solid mechanic. I like that it gives you that option. I like that no matter what, it has a negative impact. And the best part of this, I don't know if this was intentional or if it was found along the way, Baptism of Fire, very often the correct thing to do is you throw it wherever your fighter is. Your fighter's just in a part of the church, duking it out with wave upon wave of enemy. Baptism of Fire goes down. No one else goes in anymore because the location's on fire. They don't want to take damage. They don't need to be there. And the fighter just stays there in the Baptism of Fire because he's not taking damage unless he leaves and re-enters, right? And it's really, really thematically appropriate that you're very, very likely to put Baptism of Fire onto the location your fighter is having a brawl in. Canonization is a terrifying version of Crypt Shield. Instead of testing head, you test foot or fist, which is fine, really. Like, if this were just a foot test, I would have no complaints, so making it easier on your fighters is fine by me. But you either discard an ally asset and play, or remove all copies of one from your deck, and if you can't do either, it gains Surge. Note though, it only gains Surge if you fail the test, so even if you have no allies, you still get to test to avoid Surge. I really, really like this. I know it's scary as hell, but it's the kind of scary as hell that I like. Now, coming down to enemies, I'm convinced that some of this shows up again, but not all of it. Because these are all the same encounter set. Oh, they're not, I'm an idiot. I've mixed and matched 2 different encounter sets here. Like a crazy person. Penitence and Canonization do show up in another set, and we shouldn't have been talking about them, because that set absolutely does get used broadly, but since we're already here, Thumerian Doctor is a perfectly normal, good enemy, nothing to really feel strongly about with him. Church Behemoth is a big dumb idiot, and I really like that he does nothing unless you come near him and then he freaks out and throws a tantrum. I will note, however, that in this specific scenario, you can end up in a situation where he starts here, someone does something here, he runs over, and now if anyone does anything in the middle, which includes walking to or from every location in the game, he'll freak out and run in the middle, which likely has all your bystanders there, or at least 2 or 3 of them. And that becomes so suboptimal that everyone just stops moving. And that's a really unfortunate play pattern, and I don't know how to solve it, but it does need to be acknowledged that it does happen, and it's not fun if it does. It didn't happen on my channel, we just beat the shit out of the guy, but on my first playthrough, Bob and Ursula were both like, we make things worse if we just move, so we're done moving, we'll just sit here. And it was just like Daniela playing solo for the last 5 turns of the game, it just sucked. Anyways, we now talked about this set way in advance, we'll come back to it much later when we do the full roundup. The other 2 groups of enemies that come with this set are Choir Intelligence and Enraged Zealots. Choir Intelligence first. They are patrol, which very specifically means I need to bring up the rules in this set, because they might not work intentionally, or they might be way less scary than I thought they would be. You'll notice that enemies cancel and remove barricades when they're hunting. That's what it specifies, when a hunter enemy moves. But under patrol, these look like they might just be copy and pasted patrol rules, right? But then under patrol at the bottom, they don't move if there's a barricade token. So with most guys, barricades or cloovers are just like treading water, they're not doing anything. But specifically Choir Intelligence, because they're patrolling, those actually do get stopped by barricades. And that's really, really cool. It also doesn't say they find alternative routes, right? This might need additional text to say they find an additional route if they're blocked by a barricade, because as it's written, they just don't move because they can't get through the barricade. And it's good that barricades work better against these guys, so they're terrifying. They just double the amount of doom any other enemy would be facing, and they're aloof, and your fighter is busy. He doesn't have time to deal with this. So I really like this guy. It's a really interesting, threatening enemy unique to the scenario. Now, last card in the set, it's the Enraged Zealots. I've been saving them for last. There are 3 copies of a 2+2 players health massive retaliate enemy in the set. Now, admittedly, they're only 3 fists, 3 foot, they only hit for 1/1, and they don't make attacks of opportunity. But holy shit, there is so much enemy health to chew through. The idea might be that you're supposed to be throwing down barricades to stop them from getting in, But in our experience, stopping something with a barricade every turn, like, that was so hard for a Kluber to do. It was much easier to just let the fighter brawl with these guys. With the patrol guys, it's different, but with the enraged zealots, you just have a hard time, like, doing the action to get the clues, then doing the action to put them back from the token bank and doing it again and treading water with them. They're just really, really hard to barricade compared to how easy they are to fight, because they do only hit you for 1/1 a turn. You can grind through them as long as you're using melee weapons and not limited ammunition assets or charge-based assets like a Mystic would. But I like them, despite the fact they are massive, absolutely terrifying. It's a huge amount of enemy health. In my campaign, we had Overzealous go off, and we pulled all 3 at once in the same turn, and we dealt with all 3 of them within 2 turns. Like, they were just all killed. It was wild. It's some of the most fun I've had. I love super fight-based scenarios like Ice and Death Part 3, like Marrakesh, like this. Now, it is a criticism I have this scenario that, as you've seen with all the cards we've shown so far, it's just tower defense and it's really just the fighter show. There needs to be more for Klubers to do. In my game on the channel, basically, we just didn't get clues. We were just like, nah, that's a waste of time. And off the channel with 2 Klubers in my group, they both had a terrible time with this scenario, especially when the Church Behemoth moved down and started making it impossible for them to even pretend they were helping. Now, going through the scenario, as we progress through it, let's see what we're doing. The agenda progresses, and immediately Father Gascoigne shows up. And we have a problem. Like, normally I don't get too hung up on interlude stuff and flavor text. Okay, a different problem first. You're supposed to read this interlude and shuffle the hunters and pick one at random. If you didn't make a backup deck of hunters, how exactly are you supposed to do that? Like, if one guy took one, another guy took another took this one took that one. 2 of them are still in decks, 2 are in play, the other 2 are in the box. This is a setup nightmare. It seems like a really small ask, but it isn't. If you didn't make a backup set, your best bet is to write 1 through 6, put their names, and roll a dice. So I need to acknowledge that. Now, far more importantly, here he's addressed as Father Michael Gascoigne. Sure, whatever. Apparently Gascoigne's name is Michael. He's just Father Gascoigne. Not a big deal. But when we come over to the actual boss card and his name is FR period Michael Gascoigne, I have a problem. Just put Father Gascoigne. No one cares that his name is Michael. It's not important. FR period is not an abbreviation anyone uses for father. No one reads that as father. Father Gascoigne. It was good enough for FromSoft when they made the game. It's good enough for you. Now, finishing up the scenario, there's a little bit more to go. Our objective is just hold out, so as we kill the boss, which will spawn at the end of Act 2, you're going to find out killing the boss is how you progress. The boss is, it's MIA, because I lost some stuff. So you have all these bystanders, you've been protecting them. Very likely what's been forced to happen to you is they've been moved around. It's inconceivable they haven't. You'll have like one over here, and one where it was like a coin flip which location they ended up at. And even as people who all love Bloodborne at our table off screen, we just didn't realize, like, oh yeah, Sister Amelia is obviously about to turn into a monster and we shouldn't be putting them in the middle, should we? Which is a really good gotcha moment where like people were like, oh, the story's changing, whatever, we can go with it. Or new players who don't know the story can like really get got by this. I really like that. I'm shocked that it got us. It wasn't until we were about to flip the agenda that I realized that my table was like, oh yeah, you're right, we're idiots. So I really like that. I like that as a moment. And as for Sister Amelia, I just deleted the set she came from. Let me get another Bloodborne. I didn't think about it. Sister Amelia is going to introduce a new mechanic. When she comes into play, when this act card flips, you remove every single enemy from the deck and discard pile from the game. The ones in play will stay in play, they're still there. And then you shuffle in what is essentially the boss fight encounter set. You've got these copies of Fury Upon Sin, Vex and Smite, and then 4 copies of Blessed Are the Meek. And this happens in multiple scenarios. This is like the big defining thing the set does, is there are boss fight scenario sets where everything changes and it's just about the boss. Now in this case, Amelia is defined in the game by being able to heal. She heals at the end of the round. There are 4 copies of Heal Her and Surge. Fury Upon Sin is like the freest encounter card of all time. This shouldn't be in the boss fight set. If you are attacking her, you get rid of this and it does nothing. Like, this is so soft that if you gave it Surge, I wouldn't mind. And then Vex and Smite, she makes an immediate attack against the closest investigator to her, and then bystander triggers of Doom in place on them. This is a very scary card. And every single boss fight has one like this where it's just the boss slaps you. Or it slaps somebody at least. And I really like this. I love the boss fight mechanism, even if it is more setup heavy. I love the idea of it, I love the way it plays. But there is an important thing that needs to be noted. Coming over to this act, before now Doom's been negative, now it's counting up like normal and you're running out of time. Doom shows up on bystanders, if they get 3 Doom, they die. All that works. It's a little bit wordy. There's probably maybe some way to make it a little bit simpler. However, there's this thing where at the end of each round, bystanders move towards the sanctuary. If they can't, because they started there, then you put them in the victory display. That represents them getting into the stairwell and escaping down through the church's basement. Now, all of these cards have force text, where at the end of the round, you place a Doom on them. You'll notice that timing window. At the end of the rounds. Same here, at the end of the round. When 2 things happen with the same timing trigger, players determine what order they happen in. Now, I think it's the intention that you can have Amelia be here, and everyone walks in, and no one gets any Doom. Because rules as written, you can do that. And here's why I think it's the intention. If all 4 of them are alive, then you just get 4 Doom instantly. At the end of the round, and then the Doom ticks up, that's 5. You just lost. So if you're in a situation where somehow all 4 of them are like over here and no one's in the chapel, you could instantly lose. Now, here's my issue with that. I don't know that every player knows this. If it's not intentional, then the players can instantly lose. If it is intentional, then we probably want to find a way to phrase this that makes it more obvious that you're able to do this. Now, let's get into the huge overarching problem in this scenario. You have 5 bystander assets and 5 locations starting in play. These 3 are all identical. And then you have the act and agenda. You need to read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 cards before you can start playing after setup. It's way too much text. Like, this guy's a Yu-Gi-Oh card, man. He's got so much text. Look at that. I can't even read it if I zoom out a little bit. In Marrakesh and in many other scenarios, there are little story cards that have text on them for story, and then they have rules and things they do that impact the scenario. We need one of those. We need one that's like, protect the bystanders. And it has forced, check for Doom, and then forced, if 3 or more Doom, resolve the other side. And then you can strip that text out of every one of these cards and massively slim down the amount of reading we have to do. Then it just needs their unique way of reading Doom, or removing Doom rather, on the card. It needs the unique way they move on the card, and that's it. You don't need anything else. It massively slims down the amount of reading in the scenario. That's a change that needs to be made. It's one of the few things that I feel so strongly about, and it seems so obviously correct to me that I'm not phrasing it as a suggestion or a feeling. It just seems like a change that anything else wouldn't make sense to me. Alright, I've just realized this. There's forced text at the bottom of this that I thought was just a reminder of the rules. But it's actually different from the rules, because now patrol isn't blocked by a barricade. So now this is entirely contradictory of rules we were just given, and there's no reason for those rules to exist in their current state, so something needs to be changed somewhere for it all to line up. But what I was going to say is, there's this really unnecessary wordy bit. Would move into a chapel location from a graveyard, and there is a barricade in the path. During the enemy phase, if an enemy would move through a barricade, that's all you need. Because in scenario part 1, you can't place barricades in these locations in the first place. The only thing they can end up in are these exterior locations, because there's just this text here. And then when you flip this over and you can place them everywhere, there's force text here that says the same thing but for massive enemies, but it's not where it should be, which would be on the agenda. But you don't even need this, because that's just what barricades already did. So you can make the force text on the agenda simpler and just remove this. All of these specifications is creating more need for other specifications, when if there were none, the rules would just work. Unless I'm missing something, but if I am, then remove that and make it simpler. There's too much mental load. Before I do though, I forgot to actually talk about this group of allies you get access to. They're sort of like the people from Edge of the Earth, but you don't permanently track their health. If they die, that doesn't matter. They just have to not die in story events, and they don't always start in play. In some scenarios they will, but you're allowed to swap them whenever you want. So if you find out someone's gonna start in play, you can choose to start with them instead. Now, as for their effects, they all give you +1 to 2 stats. They all give you decent soak values totaling 4, except for the specifically defensive guy who has the mytho stats. He gives you slightly more, which I approve of. And in general, they're all just good on that front alone, though you might have more competitive and more valuable options available. Lightning Bolt to test 5-head or book is pretty difficult to do, and I actually never found a use for it in my playthrough. because it's just a hard test and you probably have other ways of accomplishing similar things, if you need to do that at all. But the stats she gives you are also really, really good. Like, just having a lot of sanity soak and more head is something pretty much any character can appreciate. I don't think she's particularly amazing though. Coming over to Walter Garnett, he has the ability where if you get attacked, he can take an extra horror, so it doesn't actually have more soak, but it deals a reflect damage to that enemy and draws a card, which is a very strong ability. The issue there being, he doesn't give you the stats you use to fight unless you're a Mystic. And if you're a Mystic, I guess you would like to have the additional draw, so he's already a Mystic, but he feels a little bit weird. He's helping you get hit, but he's not helping you fight. And then the stat he gives you relevant to fighting is Foot, which isn't... Like, I'm not saying these cards need to be reworked, I'm explaining why I don't particularly feel great about many of them. Coming over to Yamamura instead, we have Foot and Book, Ursula's best friend. And when you get insight tokens, you can either just make them a victory in exchange for not putting them in display, or get a second insight. And I think both of those effects are really good. Like, it's not particularly incredible, but it is definitely a stronger ally compared to these other two, I think. Eileen's ability is a little bit confused because she's giving you plus fist, but her ability allows you to spend money to disengage and flee. Now, don't get me wrong, to some degree, this is just lightning bolt spend money move. I should have gotten more use out of that than I did. That's a really good ability. Anyway, I do think Eileen's good. I think her ability is a little bit confused. The disengaging from enemies isn't really a thing Eileen does. She's a hunter. The movement's very good. This action doesn't provoke attacks of opportunities unnecessary. It's not an action, so it can't provoke them. I assume that's like a holdover from an old version of the ability that was an action. Jura gives you Fist and Foot, and if you aren't fighting, he lets you evade at 5, but you can't do that if you've already hurt somebody. Did I say Fist and Foot? He gives you Fist and Book. I mean, he's good. If you're playing somebody like a Roland or a Joe, these are obviously the stats you want. Even so, he's just a good ally if you need those stats. And typically, the characters who do need those stats can't evade for shit, so that's actually a pretty good ability in them. And then coming over to Alfred Wheeler, his ability is really, really niche. It's the only one I would like to see redesigned, because just ignoring Retaliate, like the vast majority of the time, that ability doesn't exist. Like, you can't even choose to use it, because most enemies don't have Retaliate. But when you are using it, you're usually already like able to fight that Retaliate enemy, right? Like, you have a way to get through their numbers reliably, and Retaliate's not that scary. Because if he's the only way you can get through Retaliate, it doesn't feel that good. Like, if his ability was just like a passive, you ignore Retaliate, I wouldn't even think that was overpowered. I think it was like close to in line with the others. Because a lot of Retaliate enemies are Retaliate because they're big, scary enemies. They're like the boss. So ignoring it once isn't actually that good. You need to get through it multiple times, and he's not going to do that for you. But on the whole, they're all good allies. They're all worth a slot in your deck. If any of them start in play, it's way better than not running one, and I like them quite a lot. Before you go to Scenario 3, there's an interlude with the plain doll where you ask her some questions, and you get 3 different benefits. I don't necessarily think these are all equal, but nor do I think they are meant to, so it's hardly a criticism, and we move on through the interludes to Night Unending. Before I move on to Scenario 3, I wanted to talk about the alternative ways you could be guarding the chapel in Scenario 2. The enemies I just showed are not the only set. There is a Huntsman set, if you have 0 recognition, I believe. If you have 1 recognition, a Beast set. Both of them have a bunch of enemies you've seen in the previous scenario, and some new ones. You got the Huntsman's minion, which is a minion I really like. He's just a big beefy dude, hits for 2, very easy to hit or trip though. And if there are any barricades in his movement, he kills all of them, which is yet again making it feel worse for Cloobers. Then we have Bloodclaimed Huntsman, who's got like reasonable stats, like not a terrifying enemy, but then you read his force text, and a lot of the time that can say nothing, and a lot of the time that says he attacks twice, which makes him a lot scarier. All in all, I think this one is probably much harder to deal with and much worse for Cloobers, because I don't think the rules specify, but I would assume that swarming cards each destroy a barricade, meaning that these are gonna destroy 2 barricades each. This destroys all the barricades. This one sounds really hard to hold out against. Then coming over to the Beast set, you get Scourge Beast Alpha and Beast Possessed Souls. The Scourge Beast Alpha is like virtually untrippable. He's a 3/3/5 with Retaliate. If he's in a graveyard with at least 2 other Beast enemies at the beginning of the enemy phase, destroy all connecting barricades. And it gains Hunter. So it sits still for a really long time. This card's blank. The way graveyards work is that if you have an empty graveyard, you have to spawn there. But once all the graveyards have at least 1 guy, you just pick which graveyard they spawn in. So there's no reason you would ever have another enemy in this graveyard. This card actually does nothing, and I need to go make a note about that. The Beast Possessed Soul is Retaliate 522. That's very interesting. He's easy to kill, but very hard to hit with Retaliate. Hits for 1-1. Really weak to stuff like Bloodright. Testless sources of damage that jump over your fist value entirely. He's got Patrol Location with the most Doom, which means that unless things go wrong, he won't do anything, and you can turn off the thing that's making him patrol. And Reaction, if he is evaded until the end of the round, it gets -3 fights. So once you trip him, you can hit him easily. I really like this card. I am, again, worried that good counterplay means he never goes anywhere. But if they all mean that, they can't all just sit in the graveyard doing nothing, right? No, that's not true. You have Scourge Beast Alpha in one graveyard, Scourge Beast Alpha in another graveyard, both beasts possess souls. I'm sorry, there are 5 of you, or is this done wrong? Oh, okay, there's breach. There's a breach here. There's 4 of these guys. But that's the same thing, right? Okay, there's a third Scourge Beast Alpha. At least one of them. No, they need 2 other beasts. You put 2 Scourge Beast Alphas in one graveyard, 1 Scourge Beast Alpha in the last graveyard, and then all 4 of the beasts possess souls in one other graveyard. And now, anytime you need to spawn enemies, you spawn them with the beast possessed souls. And you let your fighter just like stand there in a fight. I guess because they'll be like, you'll be drawing a bunch of guys and they'll be running in. This actually is really interesting. Trying to create a situation where nobody comes in. I really like this set. Maybe like when I play it, I'll feel like it can be solved. It's not as threatening or interesting as I feel. This seems really cool. I really like this one. And then we move on to scenario setup, and there are different levels of recognition for this one. And something I want to point out is for the previous scenario, 2 was the highest number it referenced. And you can see coming over here, I got 2 recognition. In the next scenario, I got 1 recognition. In this scenario, the total level recognition, the lowest level it acknowledges is 4. I had 3. I went from at pace with the max to under the minimum in that last scenario. I think the recognition thing, maybe I got unlucky in this scenario. That's a thing where I just like need to know how it works for other people. But I feel like the recognition threshold jumped a lot from scenario 2 to 3. Anyways, I really like scenario 3. Do you know why? It's because it's the Pallid Mask. And unlike Without a Trace, it's actually the Pallid Mask. It's not hot garbage wearing a Pallid Mask. That sentence was more awkward than I thought it would be when I started saying it. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Hunters again until we get to them. We don't need to talk about the low recognition setup, because I'm just going to talk about the high recognition every time, because it tends to just be the low recognition with more stuff, or the low recognition tends to be less interesting directly in its older stuff. The Agents of Impurity set will all be used in this scenario eventually, though it does initially seem during setup like it's only for high recognition. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And as always, stuff like this with the Milkweed bosses, I'm going to be putting them above, and we'll talk about them much later. Now, unlike Pallid Mask, your final location is going to be random. There are 3 keys you can find throughout these woods. You need one of them to escape. You won't know which one. That's a scary thing, that sort of randomness. But the Doom Clock is generous enough, and there are enough interconnected woods locations that I don't think it matters. And it's going to go... Oh, this deck is upside down for some reason. Making myself do this a little bit backwards. Shuffle these, throw 4 over here. Shuffle that in, put these on top, and that is our Catacombs deck. Or I suppose miraculously our Woods deck, isn't it? And you put the first location into play here. That's an easy rule to miss, and it's very important. And the only thing set aside in this scenario is just the 3 keys. I really like that this is legitimately just Pallid Mask, and as we go through, we're going to shuffle more enemies in when the agendas advance. Unfortunately, because I don't have like a physical copy of this, it's hard for me to tell what the scenario-specific cards are. Obviously, the trees are scenario-specific, but what about these 2 runes? What about this? What about those? What about that? I know this one isn't, so I'm going to flip through all the others and figure out what the unique sets are. I believe that this rune is unique to the scenario, this rune is unique to the scenario, and this one is unique to the scenario. I'm going to look at them and see if I remember them being in multiple sets. To my surprise, those 4 sets actually are unique to the scenario. I don't believe you ever see these again, though I could be wrong about this group. I don't believe we've ever seen this one in another scenario, though. This group is definitely unique, this group is definitely unique, and this group is also definitely unique. So let's talk about them. Let's start with this group because it's my favorite one. It's Corpse Burster. I loved him then, I love him now. However, there are a few less humanoid enemies in this scenario, and some of them have a nasty habit of killing themselves instantly. So I saw all 3 of these surge in my scenario, and I would not be surprised if that's the standard experience. We might need a few more humanoid enemies. A normal suggestion for one would just be an equivalent of the hospital orderly, because these were originally just like dudes walking around, right? They were just like night watchmen in the woods. So you could have that guy be an aloof enemy just doing his job that is a thing you got to deal with, just like the library docent in Catacombs. Twisting Serpents is a terrifying version of Crypt Shield, and I love it. It's test foot 4, and if you fail, you immediately discard an ally asset, or you gain Twisting Serpents in your threat area. If it's in your threat area, take 3 damage eventually. No alternative. Like, that's a rough choice, and I really like it. It's a great Crypt Shield variant. Mad One didn't spawn in my game, even though there's 2 of them and I drew several. My team's really good at killing, so no one lived. So Madman never showed up, it always gained Surge. I dislike the Prey identical to Prey conditions on the above enemy. Prey does almost nothing, that's just words for the sake of words. That's just, there's no reason for that, just throw it away. Theoretically, if one had spawned, it is a 4/3/4 Hunter, and you can test Book to get rid of it, so it's really not a big problem. And I do like that it exists, but it's just like kind of a nothing enemy to me. Maneater Boar really accurately represents what the boar is in Bloodborne. Over succeeding, dealing more damage to represent the parry is really, really nice. And it has enough health that if you have a 3 damage weapon, that's no problem, but if you're using something weak, you're gonna need another hit, and yeah, that checks out, that's the game. I think this is a great representation of what the boars were, and it's a good enemy, I like it. Coming over to the next set, the trees, Led Astray needs a note. I'm not going to go through the trouble of building out a map and being like, this one goes up and this one goes right and down, and then we go over here and like building a whole map like I was playing the game. However, you'll notice that you start at Odin Chapel. And I find, at least in my experience, it was the case that Odin Chapel is virtually always the furthest location from me, and it cannot be moved via encounter card effects. Some cards do specify not Odin Chapel. Led Astray does not. Led Astray is a 5-head test. It gets -1 difficulty for each clue on your location. If you fail, you swap your current location with the revealed location furthest from you. That was, in my experience, always Odin Chapel, so it always did nothing. So you discarded cards in the encounter deck until an enemy was revealed and spawned that at your location. I feel like if it's almost always that second effect, it should just be that second effect. Off the Trail is word salad. I understand why it's word salad, it's not really avoidable. I find that it doesn't do a whole lot, and I'm not really concerned with it. Like, there's this ongoing swapping locations theme in this scenario. I just don't feel like it was a big deal and did much of anything aside make me terrified if I was next to the Doom location on my final action that I might accidentally get swapped into the Doom location. Up here we have Guiding Moonlight, which is one of my favorite cards in the entire expansion. Guiding Moonlight attaches to the location furthest from you. If you investigate it successfully, which is really easy to do, it's only Shroud 2, it goes in the victory display for Victory 1. Or, if the game ends while it's in play and you weren't able to do it, get 2 less experience. This is a really cool way of just giving your players 1 experience. Like, I'm not going to pretend it's going to fail and you're going to get 2 less experience. It's not. That's not going to happen. But it's a really cool way. There's a thing in D&D, right? If you want your players to go somewhere, have them get robbed and tell them when they realize their pockets have been picked that the thief went that away. That's what this is. Tell us that we'll get an experience if we go there and we'll lose 2 if we don't. The players are now on a new pattern. That's what this is. I really like it. A Hunter Must Hunt is a really, really neat card. Not particularly scary, but it's a neat card in theory and might be really terrifying or at least really, really interesting if it were tuned up a little bit. It goes into play if there are any humanoids in play. Otherwise, it gains Surge. It's just next to the agenda deck. Everyone's affected by it. At the end of the round, everyone who didn't take a fight action against the humanoid test 5 head. If they fail, they had 1 token, 1 curse token to the bag. And if they did do fight actions, then they get a resource for every enemy that they defeated. That can be smoothed out in its wording a lot, and also the penalty is so soft that it barely matters. So personally, I would just remove the head test outright. To me, it seems like that's just there so the squid can swap locations more. If you want something like that, I would just have it swap locations. The head test is going to be failed on the vast majority of characters. 5 is a big number. Even with 5 head, you're statistically likely to fail, and this is a small enough effect at just add 1 curse that you would never commit anything to this in the first place. So I would just say, straight up, no test. If you didn't kill a humanoid, add a curse. In fact, I'd be willing to say add 2, but that's probably overtuned as shit, especially in high player counts. And then each hunter who did a fight action against a humanoid enemy gained 1 resource per enemy defeated. That's just a little bit awkward, and it's giving you something from a Mythos card. I don't feel like you need it. I feel like the idea of this card's really cool, but what it actually does is you fail a test that you were never going to pass, you add 1 curse, and the other guy gains a resource. Like, that's getting a resource for a curse as a fast action. Like, this is Faustian Bargain, the encounter card, right? It's obviously nowhere near as good as Faustian Bargain. The rate's 1-to-1, not 2-to-5. But still, like, it's just undertuned. The threat of not killing someone can't be that high because most of the time, most of the team can't. But I don't feel like it needs to give you resources. You're hunting. You're not doing it for profit. You just gotta hunt. You're a hunter. That's all there is to it. But what it currently does is just adding a curse token, and that's too soft, and it doesn't need the benefit. And I've been rambling about this for too long. Lastly, we have one more set. I felt like this one was used again somewhere else, but I can't seem to find it right now. We have the Crypt set, the Murgo set. We have Fury the Beraged, which attaches to a non-elite enemy. As an additional cost to fight them, you pay resources equal to their fight value, and you discard this if the attack is successful. If there are no non-elite enemies in play, this card gains Surge. Good card, nothing else to say about it. In my experience, I think it's surged every time, but I like the design of this card. I will note, however, the average fight value in this scenario is pretty damn high. That might not be a thing most fighters can afford to pay. I would need to see it played a couple more times. I could see this being overtuned, but in my current opinion, having played a big money fighter where this card surged every time, seems fine. We've got Vision of the Thumerian Queen, which will attach to your location, and then it's Min's weakness. You have to commit 3 matching skill icons, so half of her weakness, to investigate the location. And you may not discover clues except by investigating the location, and then once you investigate it successfully by committing those 3 icons, you get rid of this. It's a nice hiccup to throw out your cloovers. 3 is a little bit high, it's a little bit daunting, but if we're only 2, you just use a perception and it's done. So I like this. I like this quite a lot. It's a good way to throw a wrench in the cloovers, and I find not enough treachery cards do that. Not enough treachery cards make the cloovers job harder, they just do stuff to the clover. Invisible Opposition's a peril card, and this is the one where I need to specify something. The rules for peril are only applied during resolution of revelation text. If you attach it to the asset with the highest cost in your play area, and you treat it as if it were blank, like this stops it from being warded, right? That's what it does. Does it need that? It seems like a really random peril. Because it's not in your threat area, it's just attached to one of your assets. It means that no one was ever able to interact with it in the first place. You are always gonna have to spend this resource. It has to be in your threat area for someone else to interact with it. So I'm not sure if peril is just meant to stop this from warding. It seems like a random peril. I'm gonna leave the note in my Word document. I think putting peril on this does have a reason, but I'm really worried looking at this and the Bereaved, right? That these 2 cards together can just bankrupt a fighter, right? Like lose 5 to replay your flamethrower. It's peril, you can't ward it. Lose 4 to attack. You played a flamethrower, there were other assets in your deck. I think that this is actually a possibly overtuned economies tax. Playing big money fighter, like I didn't realize this. This never went off. I was able to deal with that easily, but I'm very worried that this could be overtuned. Now, that's it for the encounter cards. We could talk about the locations. I'm not going to. There's a lot of locations. It would take a while. This video is already way too long. There's a bunch of locations, you get stuff in them, it's cool. As you progress the act, you get more dudes or remember stuff. It's fine, you're finding bosses, I like it. Now, coming over to my resolution text though, you'll notice that in scenario 3 I got 12 experience. Those are Dream Eater's numbers. That's gotta get toned down. That's too much. These decks had too much experience, it wasn't okay. And then going through resolution here, one thing that I noted, I could easily be wrong about this, I'm not gonna look into it any further. I'm not sure how to get Frailty of Men 7, I believe it was. No matter where I looked, I couldn't find the words Frailty of Men 7 bolded before it. I can find 8, I can find 6, but I don't see anything anywhere in here that leads to 7. In addition, possibly related to that, there is no proceed text in any of these allies necessarily telling you where to go, and you sort of just have to figure it out on your own. So those need text, and 7 might be related to that. Moving on to our next scenario, we have the Frailty of Men. This is a scenario that has some setup issues. Every location has a Bergenworth side and a Miskatonic side. Depending on stored resolutions, different locations end up on different sides. I would really like to see, like, just left half Bergenworth, right half Miskatonic, or top half, or like, just something where you can clearly represent it and know what it is in simple words. Because this is just a mess to read. If the investigators were second to arrive, flip a university foyer, lecture hall, annex, and library to the Miskatonic side, this is the part that makes it even worse. And the research hall, it's going to be period, then the following locations start on their Bergenworth side, and then this. At the very least, that needs to change to make it a little bit easier to do. Put the side, colon, then the numbers locations. I would do that no matter what format you change this to. As it is, it's really easy to be reading Flip University Hall, Lecture Hall, Annex, you're going back and forth, Library, Miskatonic Side, Research Hall, Faculty, Ashramani, Rooftops, Bergenworth, wait, what's Bergenworth? Oh no, and then you do it all again. I just straight up messed this up, completely beefed it in my playthrough on the channel. And there doesn't really seem to be a rhyme or reason to which ones start, and also which side it starts on. Like, neither side seems particularly good or bad for you, they're just different. And it's a 50-50 chance of being the side you need to get the memory that you're going to be getting. Honestly, I think I'd like to just see it be like, the top 5 are one, the other 3 are the other, and you invert it. One set's for the good resolution of the previous stuff, whatever that means, the other set is for everything else. Having 3 different sets takes up more text, gives you more chances to read the wrong thing. If it's just the top row, you can say all locations in the top row begin on their Bergenworth side. It's really easy. So I would really like it to just always be these 5. Like, I can't really see rhyme or reason to which ones are which in the first place. Having it be the top row makes it really simple. And like, you have so much text here that you're having to use shorthand, right? Library isn't a location. I know you mean a private library, but this just needs to be simplified in a way that's easier for players to not mess it up and like flipping back and forth get it wrong, which is exactly what happened in my case. In this scenario of rules for flipping locations, they say that you flip it so that the clue value is equal to its maximum shroud value. That's definitely a typo, that should say clue. Coming over to the agenda card, it references the amount of doom on agenda 1A. Now, admittedly, there is only agenda 1A. However, what if we just said on the agenda? Like, eventually we do get a new act and it starts being just 0, but it would already have been 0 because there wasn't doom on it anyway, so like, just have it be the agenda. It's easier. And I think we should go take a look at the encounter sets here. The Nightmare Apostle specifically shows up in a lot of other scenarios. He's not only in this scenario, but the rest of his encounter set is only going to be showing up here in Bergenworth. The Nightmare Apostle is a super cool card. I love this guy. He's not really threatening. I don't think he's supposed to be. He's a 3/1/1 Hunter Aloof Swarming X. X is the amount of doom on the agenda, so that can be very funny in certain situations, but usually it's a very low number in the scenarios he shows up in. Prey most resources, only if they have 1 or more. When he's at the location with its prey, he loses a loop because he's trying to rob you. You'll notice he doesn't hit for damage. If you have more than 0 resources and he attacks, you lose 1 resources. If you have 0 resources, he disengages and exhausts. He's not interested. He robbed you for all you got. And I love this. Like, he doesn't do anything. He's really easy to kill. He doesn't bother you very much. He's like not a problem, but he's awesome. I love it. I love the gaggle of spiders that are trying to steal your money. And I mean, hell, that's a good way to like make Patches the Spider into a character. This is just a basic enemy. Takes -1 damage from fight actions, makes it impossible to punch him. He's basically a 3/2/3. Not really any text. He's a cool Acolyte variant, and that he's the only Acolyte that spawns trying to beat the shit out of you instead of running away. And I just like to see that. It's weird that official Arkham has not actually had that. They haven't had an aggressive monster with Doom yet. The Bulwark guarding Sleep is potentially very problematic. As an example, this guy could take -2 damage on fight actions and be literally unkillable for a round. In general, it makes fighting much harder, and I think I would like this card more if Oozing Scholar had different text, like if he just had 2 health, for instance, and could not be damaged unless you were using an action asset on an asset, which would also make him immune to Blood Rights and throw a different Rich in the Spanners, because as it stands, like, a lot of people are just trying to get by with machetes, and it's possible for this guy to be machete immune, which is worrying. But if that's fine, then that's fine. I don't have a strong opinion about it, but it does stand out to me as a concern. Now, when I played this, I had a problem with the Veil Torn Asunder. I had a problem with the whole scenario because I'm bad at the game. The first agenda I flipped was the one where you search for enemies, so you have to shuffle the encounter deck. It does have an instruction there that I think it doesn't need to have. Specifically, when you get the monster version, you shuffle the discard pile into the encounter deck instead of just shuffling the decks you searched like other search mechanics would. I would have it just shuffle the decks you searched. The encounter deck for this set's very big. It's like 40 cards. Let's get another copy and check. It is a 47 card encounter deck. It's kind of huge. The less recognition version is a bit smaller. It's a more reasonable number. The low recognition's only 40 cards. Like, it's a huge encounter deck. So having a one-of card defining the scenario doesn't feel very good. Having a potentially cycling agenda shuffling the encounter discard pile into the deck is not a good thing. When I played this, I did it wrong. I had gotten that as my first agenda, and I misread all the others, thinking they kept shuffling the deck and discard pile. So I thought this scenario was much more random in its encounter set than it was. I'm surprised I got to see as much of it as I did, considering how badly and incorrectly I was playing. But my most major criticism of this scenario does go away. The encounter deck is still too big. That's like the size of, what is it, the penultimate scenario in Dunwich. Whatever that's called, you know what I'm talking about, climbing the hill. So I do think the encounter set here is just a little bit too big. And I'm not sure what I would suggest to cut, because that's not really what I'm here to do. Now, Arkham Surging and Garden Surging do help this. There's a lot of Surge cards in the set. These are 6 of the cards. It's really only a 41 card deck, which is still quite large. But it's better than it seems. This just flips locations. It can throw a wrench in your plans. It fits what you're doing in the scenario. You're like trying to get to the right side of Bergenworth, whether that's on Arkham or Yharnam, to find these memories and do the thing. I like these cards. They're really good. I have to come back to Leap of Faith because I've been reading the card wrong. This is a card where you have to test Brain or Head 4 when you leave, and if you succeed, you throw this away. Otherwise, you don't move, and you flip all the locations connected to yours as well as your own. That's not true. You actually don't flip your own location, just the connecting locations. I really like this. At first, I was really afraid that it would seriously muck up like a Joe Diamond, but you just need somebody to come past it. I really like this card. It's a good way of throwing a wrench in the works and just being an action tax Mythos card in a really interesting format. Honest to God, I don't remember what Silver Reflection did. She's a 1/2/1 hunter, can't be damaged except by spells or relics. She only hits for 1 horror, and if she does, then you can cancel all the damage and horror done by her and shuffle that asset back into your deck. You can test Book or Head 4 to shuffle her back into the deck and get a Clue. She's interesting. I really like her. She's like the sort of weird ghost that I want out of a weird ghost. The Poltergeist from Carcosa is just like a ghost that beats the shit out of you and you can't deal with it a lot of the time. This is a ghost that you should be able to find a solution to that's never going to be that bad. You can trip it. You might not be able to kill it, though. You can make it go away, probably. If it does hit you, like, you can always just not have it kill you. Like, this is a really interesting enemy. It's not a huge problem, but I really like it existing. Unlike Garden of Eyes. Garden of Eyes is the biggest problem enemy I've ever seen. I never thought I'd say a 2/3 enemy with it hit for 1/1 could be this bad, but it's a nightmare. It's got 5 foot, it's aloof, alert. None of that really matters. Aloof matters. Alert and 5 foot, don't care. Patrol, Bergenworth location with the highest shroud. Cool, they're walking around. Not a big deal. Forced, as an additional cost to perform a non-move action at this location being wherever it is. Test 3 foot. If you fail, Garden of Eyes attacks you. So let me go through a short list of non-move actions. Engaging the Garden of Eyes. Attacking the Garden of Eyes with the machete the first time. Attacking Garden of Eyes with the machete when you auto-failed the first one. Attacking it with the machete the 4th time, because you still have to deal 1 more damage to finish killing it. So I'm editing this, I get to the Garden of Eyes, and I'm so traumatized by Laurent Silverbeast in the 7th scenario that I read this card out to you, everything that it said was right, and then I go on this tirade about Laurent Silverbeast instead, for no reason. So Laurent Silverbeast is another similar card that's also a nightmare in its scenario, but let's talk about Garden of Eyes here because it's the card that's actually on the screen. I think Garden of Eyes is absolutely terrifying, and I love it. The only reason I was upset as I was is because I was misremembering Laurent Silverbeast when I was talking. This thing's terrifying, and absolutely might just slap the shit out of you. You could deal a huge amount of damage. And then there is counterplay. You can leave. You can flip the location and you can leave, and he'll leave, and you can come back later, and it does slow you down a lot. The counterplay is really messy. It's a huge hassle to go through the effort of flipping the location, leaving, coming back later, flipping it, then getting the clues before he gets back. Like, it's not pleasant to deal with the Garden of Eyes. But it's not supposed to. This guy is a scenario-defining problem, and I really, really like him. And honestly, I don't have much more to say about the scenario. I like the final fight with Rom, I like the general idea of it. In my experience, it went on way too long, but I think that's because I had terrible tempo. I need to see this played a second time. But maybe not, right? Because, like, there are 8 locations. On average, you'll get 50% of your guesses right, more, because you'll start making informed guesses later. So you should expect to see 12 locations. 12 locations isn't the biggest map. I think the amount of time mine took was unusual. I think this scenario isn't as long as it felt when I played it. I think it just had terrible tempo, did something wrong, not quite sure. However, there is still a little bit left to go in this scenario beyond just cleaning it up and moving to the next one. At the end, you get a random weakness. There are 4 different weaknesses you could get. And I'll tell you immediately what I want my feedback to be for this one. Give class-based weaknesses instead. don't randomize weaknesses unless all weaknesses are doing broadly the same thing, and these are doing very different things. Here's an example. -1 foot. 4 out of 5 classes don't care that you just did that to them. -1 head. Everyone cares a little bit, but mystics are a lot more upset, especially 4-head mystics. As an additional cost to investigate, take a direct horror. Let me tell you, fighters don't care. And my favorite, rapturous writhing. As an additional cost to fight or evade, spend an additional action. This never goes away. I'm going to talk about them in a little more detail. These two on the left are wildly overtuned. These two on the right aren't as bad, but they're all crazy high variance depending on who gets what, and I don't like it at all. The Bottomless Curse is a -1 foot penalty. As an additional cost to fight, you must take a horror or discard a card from your hand. Literally forgot about that part of this. Definitely a lot harsher than I thought it was, just forgot it did that. Is there a symmetrical effect here? Oh, you can't parlay. Yeah, I thought they both had text like that. This is substantially more important than not being able to parlay. I actually don't remember seeing a parlay check after I got these, which is very funny. Anyway, as an additional cost to fight, take a horror or discard a card. You want to get rid of it? You can't. Shuffle it back in your deck, take a direct damage. That's really brutal. These are substantially worse, like all of them, if they affect you at all, are substantially worse than any basic weakness. Of course, you could be playing a book-based Clover and this card doesn't exist. Then over here on Moon Scented, everyone doesn't like losing their head. If parlaying were a part of scenarios, that would be bad. And it's the same thing, you can't really get rid of it, take a direct horror. Now, I would think that this should be as an additional cost to parlay, take 1 and damage, or discard a card to be symmetrical to Bottomless Curse. Right now it's not. But as a whole, this one's just incredibly soft, unless you're specifically a Mystic. If you are specifically a Mystic, this is a nightmare. Unless you are specifically Diana, in which case your 9 head being reduced to 8 is not meaningful. Wild Curiosity is, it's a thing. It's like the closest to being balanced and normal out of all of them, but on Cloovers, this makes you stop getting clues for 3 rounds. The +1 book doesn't matter. You stop getting clues for 3 rounds, or this literally kills you. I thought this was okay because I thought it was removing them. It's not. On Fighters, this does literally nothing. On Cloovers, you skip the next 3 rounds, basically. Like, I don't know how you're supposed to take 1 direct horror multiple times a turn for the rest of the game, because every time you do this, you put a token on it, meaning it's not going away. And then with Rapturous Writhing, it's the same deal. It starts with 3 resources on it. At the end of your turn, remove 1 resource from it. If there are no resources on it, discard it. But you're going to be putting them right back on if you fight or evade at all. And sure, you get +1 head, who cares? As an additional cost of fighting and evading, you're spending an additional action and making this never go away. And again, on a Clover, this doesn't exist. It goes away on its own, it's completely blank. So, like, all of these are wildly different in what they do nothing on some characters, cripple you on other characters, wildly overtuned compared to basic weaknesses. I would argue that these two are worse than almost every signature in the game. What's this one do that's not what I thought it did? This one's also worse than most signatures in the game. As an additional call, it's not worse than most signatures, but it's definitely worse, I think, than most basics. If you're a fighter, you have to take a horror or discard a card and do your job. If you want to get rid of it, you take a direct damage and put it back in your deck. It never really goes away. This is pretty rough. This one's the softest, but both the ones on the right are pretty soft. This one's not nearly as soft as I thought it was because it has different text than I thought, but still. I don't like these. I don't like these. I don't like how variable they are, how random they are, how strong they are. When I was playing, I straight up said if I got Rapturous Writhing, I would just not play with it. I would just roll again. This is actually insane. This is such a brutal card that my only assumption is that they were changed and they used to do what I thought it did, where you remove a resource instead of putting one, because this is it just kills your fighter. This kills your Clover. This makes your fighter absolutely god-awful at their job. They can attack once a round unless they have bonus actions. So yeah, harsh things to say about the weakness set. Now, coming into the next scenario, you're gonna get the quest stack. These are permanent things that maintain their progress between scenarios where you're trying to get something from your allies. If you fail, you can kill your ally, and if you succeed, you can get special items from them. I generally think all of these items aren't really worth the trouble and wouldn't even improve my deck if I put them in, so I think they all need a buff. I won't be dwelling too much on why, because this video is already way too long. If I'm gonna give full opinions on everything else, I have to on this, don't I? Like, it's already, like, what, 5 hours long? Let's just go ahead and talk about everything. This is Magnifying Glass with incredibly minor synergy for Blessed tokens, or sorry, Insight tokens. I'm sorry, I just wasn't looking for a Magnifying Glass out of this. My hand slots are full. Eileen's Blades of Mercy are a rogue weapon, and that's why they're terrible. I want more like what you see out of the Rikuyo at the end of the campaign. I want more like what you see out of the other alternate weapons we get. this just doesn't do enough. Succeeding by 2 or more against an enemy that you didn't kill lets you disengage and run away. Like, that's not even helpful. The problem is that I didn't kill them. Help me kill them instead. The small resonant bell is the most usable. It's a handheld item that gives you +1 head, so mystics that aren't using Cyclopean Hammer really like this. This is the one that I would actually generally consider using. The secondary ability on it is very, very low impact, and I don't think I particularly care about it. Pungent Compound on a team that's struggling with fighting could really benefit from this. There are definitely some enemies that are non-elite, namely the Silver Laron Beast. Those guys are a huge hassle. So I can see this being useful, but it's not the best. I don't want to be drawing it over the cards that are my job. Dr. Yosef's Clarified Blood seemed sick, but there were never any really like specific high difficulty tests I felt I was struggling with where you would actually want this later in the campaign. So the fact that I could use this to pass like basically any test didn't actually matter. Wait, no, this is overpowered. This is a lightning bolt you can use anytime you want, which includes during another skill test. You can draw a Mythos card that says test head on a mystic, or sorry, test foot, and say, no, I used Clarified Blood, I test head, all right, I passed by 6. I'll take that foot test at up 6, thank you very much. That probably needs a during your turn to prevent that. That's a little bit not okay. And yes, that does make the item jankier, but being able to use it for Mythos tests that are not head and mystics is the one thing it does right now that's very broken. Or to make this more valuable, there should be more tests later in the campaign where you actually need to like test foot or whatever 5 or 6. Confederate Oath is super, super cool, but you'd only ever really run this in like a Seeker. You need a lot of draw to feel good about running a Myriad card that doesn't count towards deck size. But if you do have the amount of draw to justify doing this, your teammates can give you a lot of +1s. Why am I thinning out my deck for this? That's what it is. Why am I thinning out my deck for this? What's the point? You also like specifically need to be the bodyguard or the escorted Clover, because if you're playing double flex like I was, you're not even going to be at the same location half the time, so this would do literally nothing. So that's a quick summary of why I'm not a huge fan of these cards. And the one minor criticism I have, halfway down, apparently this guy's name was John at some point. That final forced effect does not call him Jack. Whichever one is wrong needs to be corrected. I assume it's the one John. Anyway, done talking about Quest. Now, getting this big gaggle of act decks, you'll notice I currently have 36 acts out, and the reason why is because these decks aren't quite as set up as they should be. We have Act 1, we have Act 2, then on the back we actually do have 2 Act 5s, there's 1 Act 4, but there are 4 Act 3s in the middle. Is that it, or is it 4 Act 4s? Yes, there are 4 Act 3s in the middle. What's going to happen is this tells you which Act 3 you're supposed to go to, and you remove the other ones. So when the setup tells me which Act 2 variant I get, it should also just remove the other Act 3s as well. So in this case, like it wants me to go do Legacy of Lady Canehurst. So it should just be that. And then instead of this 9-act deck, you're going to have a 6-act deck, which is much, much more reasonable. And as it is, like it's a setup button that's just not fully set up. This is a minor thing, but it needs to be noted because I'm giving playtest feedback. If I don't note all the things, then what's the point? So that's the note about the act decks not being fully set up. Actually, I do have more feedback to give on the quest. I can talk about the things you actually do to progress. I seem to have lost the jail cell. I'm gonna get a new copy of all this. So I did lie, I have a little bit more feedback to give about the quest objectives, because I have some notes that I forgot I made. So Jack Crawford has 5 foot, right? You cannot evade Jack Crawford, last line. That foot should just be a dash. You can't evade it. There's no reason to put a number there. I do feel like Nightmare of Annalise is very hard to kill. Like, just dealing 1 damage at a time for 2 players' health could take a lot. This testing 6 is very high. Speller Relics only has nothing to do with Alfred, so I'm worried that could be very overtuned. Blood Vials is interesting in that it doesn't require you to use it to actually add the Clarified Blood to your deck. I don't know if that's an oversight or if it's supposed to be that way. And the last quest I have a comment on is Underground Cell. This is a 4-shroud location. You may not leave this cell except by the ability printed below. If it has no clues on it, move to a connecting location and put it in the victory display. At the end of the scenario, flip it over. And if you left, then you get the upgrade, and if you didn't leave, then you lose the ally. That's all fine. The problem is it has 5 clues on a 4-shroud location. And Revelation, put this into play connected, but not adjacent to your current location, and move the investigator controlling him here. If you cannot, the investigator who drew the underground cell. So investigators may not enter or leave this except by the ability printed below. Here's the important one. Enter. If you got thrown here and your team was like, are you serious? Your quest makes us get 5 clues from a 4-shroud location? That would be bad. But they can't even go in there. If your fighter pulls this, congratulations. He's dead. He's never getting out of there. Good luck. And I think the idea is like your Kluver is most likely the one with this quest, but just let people enter. Like, what if your Kluver goes in there, the fighter can't protect him, and your Kluver draws any enemy in the game? This does not need the text, you cannot enter. May not leave, that's fine, but cannot enter, that's game breaking. So an important bit of feedback I have is when you go into Act 2, you set these locations in a vertical line, and it just says according to the diagram. But if you come over to the diagram, you'll see green at the bottom. Okay, cool, we got a green. And then we can't see the names, we can barely see the art, it's very bad. But then we see like a comma, a squiggle, it's that sort of color, the something something. It's the Bridge of Saints. You can barely make it out, it's a nightmare. This needs to be higher resolution, and it's too small to be higher resolution. So instead, just like say in a vertical line with X at the top, then so on and so forth. Like you can't use this picture, it just doesn't work. Now, as you progress through this scenario, you're gonna find that every single one of these portraits, there are 2 different versions, all of them have a key. They're going to attach like over here, the rooms all spawn to the right. It doesn't really matter which side they spawn on, but they all say that. Now, here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, they're all like symmetrical. We do the thing with victory good, except we don't really, because this is actually one of these doesn't have victory. This one has 2 shroud, no clues, victory 1, which is weird. It goes into play, and you put a key on it like all the other locations. And then if you draw an enemy with a kin trait, it's drawn from the encounter deck or another card, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, you spawn it here instead. Every time an enemy spawns here, you put a clue on this location. You can't clear this. It will get clues every turn of the game. And the finale, by definition, is not going to be next to this. 3 out of 4 times. This is a very bad design for a victory location. It needs to have different text, or it needs to not be victory and you have like these be victories instead. This is not okay for a victory location. You cannot be randomly spawning clues across the map on victory. That's toxic. That's just griefing your players, man. Now, one thing that confuses me just a little bit is in the scenario setup here, you gather all these encounter sets, but none of these are the Milkweed counter set. None of this tells you to do the Milkweed stuff. And then in the resolution, I think it's in R5. It's all the way at the end. But it tells you to, like, if there's metamorphosis cards, you return them to the collection. That's just like a placeholder. There's no metamorphosis in this. So either you should get metamorphosis cards and you don't, or this text shouldn't be here. And I seem to have gotten it all out of order. I feel like I've been dwelling on a lot of negative stuff for a while. I feel like since this is all feedback on things that need to be fixed, I've gotten way off topic of just how much I like this campaign. So I do want to briefly bring attention to the like massive flavor win that is Ebrietis. I love this. I love the audience chamber as a room. I love Ebrietis as a boss, how she like perfectly embodies that she just doesn't want to mess with you if you don't mess with her. I like the alternate win condition that seems incredibly hard to get. I feel like this is a bit overtuned. 1 players plus 2 is still pretty hard. But I like that it's there. It's just that this takes a minimum of 2 players plus 2 turns, or actions rather, to kill this. And also you get -1 for this test for each card committed, so like a lot of skills aren't even helpful, which feels weird. Like Resourceful is a skill very often run that just doesn't help. So I would like to see this toned down in some way, but I like the alternate win condition where you don't kill Ebrietis. I like the just like victory location where it's like, do you have the time to get the clues and kill it? Because my Doom clock was a very tight. And maybe it's like that other scenario, I think it was the Frailty of Men, where I almost ran out of Doom, and I don't quite know why. But I think the Doom clock on this one's just really tight, and this is actually a really interesting victory rush at the end. My only complaint here is that I think maybe the Altar of Despair requires too many offerings. Maybe it should just be 1 players plus 2, maybe it should just be 2 players, but it feels like when I got there, I was out of time. There was no way we were ever doing it. And I feel like it just always takes more time than killing Ebrietis, unless you have a million Ken items, in which case, testing 6 with -1 on skill cards is still not easy. And I've gotten way ahead of myself. I almost was about to move on to scenario 6, and I never even talked about the sets that are unique to this scenario. Shame on me. There's a bunch of stuff going on where your cards get turned into Ken cards and then other things reference them, and it's all very cool. I like that mechanic, it's really cool. I love it when something happens, I'm like, huh, where's that going? And Savor the Starlight's part of that, it just turns something into a Ken item. We've got several copies of cards here that are just going to turn locations into kin locations. We've got the Conductor of the Choir, who's going to add curses to the bag, but you also can't even kill them if there are kin about, which basically there always are, so unless you draw this guy first turn, he's just gonna, you know, shuffle back in forever, which is a neat recurring enemy. I like the Luminwood Covenant. I like that it's making you die, but it's also giving you Braid and Kin Trade. All that makes a lot of sense. And you can get rid of it, but like if you try and you're not good at it, we'll put Curse in the bag. You should. I like all of this card. I don't know. It doesn't do much, but it feels right to me. It feels like a card where at the end you're like, oh, I guess I got to stop being an alien, huh? I really like the Living Failures. Brain Suckers I'm all right with. They're just an enemy to me. I don't have strong opinions on them. It's neat that you, if you get hit by them, you lose all your insight. That's a great representation of game mechanics, but he's kind of a chump. I love Living Failures. In Return to Forgotten Age, one of the most important questions is how do you deal with the Vengeance Snake, the Zero Vengeance Snake, where every time one comes out, all the others pop back out. That's what this Zero Victory Living Failures is. It's just those snakes scaled up a little bit. And I like it. I like being told you have to deal with this. You don't technically have to, but I mean, you totally have to. And I like them. I honestly think they could do with being a little scarier. I wouldn't mind if they hit for 1/1 or if they had 4 health. Both of those seem like buffs you could give them that would be completely within reason. But then again, the Living Failures are chumps, and I think most people know the speedrun strats where they never even attack you, so it's fine if they suck. Speaking of being fine if they suck, the Celestial Emissary is just a trash mob. I love that. There's 3 of them. It spawns where the most kin cards are. Its health is number of kin cards, which is very frequently like between 1 and 4. It's not hard to hit. It's not hard to trip. It doesn't deal much damage. There's 3 of them, even though it's unique boss in the game, but God, it sure didn't feel like one. I love Celestial Emissary. My favorite bit of flavor in this whole campaign is the relentless shit-talking that is making Celestial Emissary a trash mob. I love that. That's my kind of BM. Anyway, Second Childhood goes into play next to the agenda deck. While it's in play, you can't use cards with the Ken trait. So this is one of the ways it gets involved with other stuff, and it can only discard 1 at a time. Personally, I would like it if this were a bit harsher in some way. And I don't even know how it could be harsher, because it's already fully disabling the card, right? But it's just like not the biggest deal. It doesn't even do that much. Honestly, you could give it Surge. Surge is represented in this campaign, but if Surge is going to be represented, let's go ahead and make it a like constant theme. This does almost nothing, give it Surge. Because like, what's it really doing? It's causing the one asset you attach this to not be usable. You don't even have to attach that to an item that like has activate abilities. You can throw this on like a magnifying glass. So I'd like to see Savor the Starlight changed so that it did not just attach to anything. It needs to attach to something with an action, a lightning bolt, or a reaction. Also, once again with Savor the Starlight, it being a peril just stops water protection and really nothing else. They already aren't doing anything involving with this decision making. You're doing all that on your own, basically. It's attached to an item. It's not in your threat area, so they couldn't have touched it. It's just sort of a random peril. Don't really know why it's there. And it's my favorite enemy in the set. I absolutely love this guy. 1/1/1 Swarming 1 Celestial Foundling. I love this guy. His text is so good. Forced, if you touch him, take a horror. How dare you? Then as an action, test book 3, if you succeed, get an insight into the display, shuffle him back into the encounter deck and all of his swarm cards too. Well, not the encounter deck, the original decks, you know. I love this guy. I love that if you take the book test, which if you do, he slaps you, by the way. That does not say it doesn't trigger attacks opportunities. He's still upset with you. It freaks you out and you get bit. If you try to hit it, you freak out and you take a horror. If you try to study it, it bites you. If you do study it while someone else is holding it down, that's great. And then you just get an insight and it goes away. And that's like such a wonderful representation of like what these are in the game. And then in addition, they fit really well into like the scenarios themselves. I love these guys. Moving on to scenario 6, A Call Beyond. This is the scenario I had the most trouble with. There's nothing in setup that I'm really too concerned about with. Most of it makes sense. The only thing I have any issue with in setup is each investigator begins play at the mirror chamber indicated on the following page, and then the following page makes no such indication. It should just say the mirror chamber on the left, and down here it's going to make it kind of obvious. With the Augur of Embriatis, that when you're adding an empty space to your right, you can figure it out. And technically it doesn't matter which side you start on as long as you build it correctly. Like as long as you start on the right, if you build up on the left, you're good. But just like note that it's the one on the left, and I guess I should place it down. And you'll notice this map looks pretty empty. The reason is because we're using the empty space mechanic. And in this case, we don't quite have enough room for them. It's going to be like this, which is a bit awkward, and it's going to get into my feedback in a second. Coming to the next page, you can see we have a location placement here. Then on Act 2, we're going to build out another wing. And then on Act 3, we're going to fill out the entire square. The way these empty spaces work is whenever you walk into one, let's say we walk into this one, you shuffle this back into their owner's deck, you draw 2 cards from this deck, and you pick one to summon. Now, nowhere in the rules does it actually tell you to reveal these cards. According to rules as written, you pick from 2 identical cards, and it's completely random. There's no point other than, like, there was no point, period. There's no point at all if you don't reveal them, so the rules should say to actually reveal the top 2 cards. But then you're going to pick which one you want, and you're going to put it down. If it has a forced effect that fails, you can't pick that one. Or more accurately, you can pick that one, but it fails, cancels the movement, and boots you back. Now, coming over to the instructions on Nightmare of Mensis, there's some contradictory instructions here, and there's some missing instructions here. And it makes the whole thing a jumbled mess before we even get into my problems with the actual scenario. So first, the way this works is, after a player attempts to move an empty space, they must draw the top 2 cards of the Nightmare of Mensis deck, unless otherwise instructed. There are a few locations that tell you to draw 3. I don't think there's any other things, but this is what otherwise instructed is about. Choose one to put into play at the location of the empty space you are moving to, and complete your move action and move to it. Shuffle any other location cards drawn back into the Nightmare deck. It's not necessarily obvious what draw means here, because you can't actually draw these to your hands. It could just mean this, but you don't. This isn't a choice. This is just random. It's the same as drawing the top. So it should say reveal the top 2 and pick one, unless otherwise noted. And in addition to that, I think I'd prefer it if rather than shuffling it back in, you put the other one on the bottom to guarantee you saw all the locations. And to prevent something that happened to me. In my scenario, we got Hypogean Jail, and I wasn't able to see what this was. Or sorry, I wasn't able to use its forced effect to spawn it. I had all the amygdalas in place, so I couldn't summon this location without killing one of them. And killing them was a hassle, so I didn't bother. But I kept drawing this, which always just forced me to pick the other one. If it had went on the bottom instead, it would avoid that little bit of RNG. So the first feedback is this should say reveal, and the second bit of feedback is I would really like to put the other one on the bottom instead of shuffling it in. Now, this thing where I was talking about failed forced effects, causing the location not to spawn, it's in the rules here, but it's not bolded. It's the last sentence. If it fails to fulfill it, or if it's impossible to fulfill, shuffle it back and cancel the effects of the move. That needs to be bolded. That's the last thing you might think you've got it and skim over. This is very important. And several of the locations appear to have been written before that was text. Let me find some examples. Yeah, here, Hypogean Jail immediately. If you cannot, take 2 horror, cancel the effects of any move. Blah, blah. This is just the normal rules, but take 2 horror. And there are other ones where I believe it just says if you fail, you can't do it without really any additional penalties, right? If an investigator cannot do it, if the condition fails, cancel the effects of any move in progress, same stuff. No additional penalty, no horror this time. And technically that Hypogean Jail horror can't ever happen to you because you cancel the move by the rules already, so the forced effect wouldn't even trigger, and you're always given a choice, so if you're going to fizzle a location, there's always another location you can fizzle that doesn't deal you horror, so there's no point in having that at all. So I'm going to go make some quick notes that Dangling Cells and Hypogean Jail have redundant text that doesn't need to be there at all. Now, coming to the agenda, there's one looping agenda. You can never run out of time. So, this scenario can run very long, and we'll go over how long it ran for me. However, first I want to talk about some stuff that's wrong in the back of it. Put him into play at the furthest mirror chamber from all investigators, ready him and resolve his patrol keyword once. You just put him into play, you don't need to say ready him and, by definition, he's going to be ready. So resolve his patrol keyword, and then once doesn't need to be there either, because without specification, it's just going to be once. Now, the bigger issue, we just put him into play at a mirror chamber, right? He's going to shuffle the furthest empty location into the Nightmare of Mensis deck. Well, if he spawns at a mirror chamber at any point during the scenario, other than the very end, the furthest location is going to be a mirror chamber. That should say non-mirror chamber location. It does not work in its current text. Next, if he's alive, you ready him and resolve his patrol keyword twice, that's totally fine. I think technically you don't need to ready him, because there's no way he can ever be evaded. There's nothing that can ever do that because he has the elite tag. But just in case, future-proofing, it's fine. But if at any time he occupies a location containing an investigator, he immediately attacks those investigators, isn't really a timing window. So let me ask you a question. He's not moving. He's at his final destination, so patrol stops triggering. He's at the 6th Shroud location. He's going to stay there. Someone's with him. How many times do they get hit? They get hit once because they occupied at some point? Does he fail to trigger a patrol twice but still hit them 2 additional times for 3 hits? What if he's there, he walks out and walks back in? Does he hit them twice or once? What I would probably suggest rephrasing this to, because getting hit for 4 horror by an agenda flip is just devastating no matter what, and you can play around that. But I would suggest changing it to anytime he enters an investigator's location, he immediately attacks those investigators. This does mean if he's at his objective, he's just not going to hit you. And that's unfortunate, but there needs to be a clear timing window where this attack goes off. Otherwise, it's not clear how some of these things work. And you can see in this next one, they actually do have it phrased correctly. It's just a minor mistake up here, non-mirror chamber location. However, something else that's a problem. They say shuffle the location Mensa deck, and that's what they say here as well. If we come over to the rules on empty locations, these are more or less copy-pasted from, the Black Throne. Unfortunately, there's some text here that's a problem, and we need to talk about it now. Nothing tells us to put down empty space if a location goes away. So this basically needs an entirely new bit of text that's copied and pasted and then heavily edited. Because 1, we need instructions to put empty space down if a location goes away through a method other than shattering. To that end, I would also then suggest putting shattering after empty space, so that it's clear that it's going to have a different effect than what empty space normally does. Because there are some times you shuffle cards into the deck, and there are other times where you shatter them and they don't come back. The other thing is, because this is a copy-paste, empty space is not a location and cannot be entered by enemies or investigators unless otherwise noted. Technically, we've otherwise noted, but this is very confusing. Combine that with the fact there are no use for clues until Act 3, you feel like you're playing wrong when you're just walking forward and this told you not to, and you're getting clues but they have no purpose, and you think you've missed something. And the easiest way to solve this problem with shuffling cards back in is not to add more text to these cards, it's to add more text to the rules. There are lines here that shouldn't be here, and there are lines that should be here that aren't, and cleaning up empty space does a lot to fix many of the rules problems in this scenario. Now, with this case, all the stuff getting swapped, it can never happen to a player's location. But there are some mechanics in this scenario where a location gets swapped. Or not swapped, replaced with empty space. So I have a question. What happens if a player is on the location that would be getting targeted? Because it's not always empty. Sometimes it's just like an adjacent location. There are mechanics that can hit a location where the most valid target has a player at it. Is that an invalid target? Do we go to the next one? That's what I did. Do we shuffle it in and immediately get a new one? That seems weird. So there should be something somewhere, probably again in, I don't even know. There probably needs to be an entire section somewhere in here on shuffling locations. And in that section, we're going to clarify 2 things. No, we're going to clarify one thing that also gets clarified in shattering. It needs to be clarified in either night mirrors or empty space. Like what happens if a player or anything else is on a location that gets shuffled in. Because with enemies, they could just be at this empty space, it's fine, but a player can't. I don't think, anyway, maybe they can. But with shattering locations, it doesn't specify here that a location has to be empty to shatter it. My assumption while playing was that it does. That might have just artificially made the scenario a lot longer. I don't think it needs to be clarified that you can shatter a location that has stuff on it. It doesn't say you can't, so therefore you can. I think if I weren't alpha testing, I wouldn't have made bad assumptions about that. One thing that does need to be clarified with shattering locations is it does specifically say you shatter a location and play, and also that empty space is not a location. So you can't shatter empty space. Now, that's really fine by me, but it does bring up a thing. This scenario runs very long. This is probably the longest scenario in the campaign, and when you get to Act 3, you just have to run through 7 locations to reveal them before you can shatter them. And that's fine. That gets you victory, it means you're playing out more of the scenario, but it really doesn't feel like it necessarily needs to be that way. I feel like I should be able to shatter the mirrors even if I haven't walked through all this stuff. And the main reason I bring this up, like it's fine on face value that you have to reveal them, but the scenario runs very long. So if the scenario needs to be shortened in some way, changing shatter a location here, or more accurately changing empty space is not a location to is a location there. Like either way, you need to find a way to reduce the scenario length, so if you want it to be that they have to reveal everything, which I think is important to the scenario, then this does need to stay the same way, but something else needs to get cut. The first way I would suggest making the scenario shorter, you'll notice this is not a square, it's a rectangle. The actual dimensions physically are a square, but this is 3 cards to 4. Just make it really a square. Make it 3 across on every side. And then in tabletop sim, instead of the nonsense I'm doing, you'll have that, and you won't have like the extra card. And I think just removing those 2 locations does a little bit to help the scenario. It'll still play really long, But if you're not doing the incorrect shattering where you can't shatter locations with attachments or enemies that I was, then the scenario shouldn't be quite as long. Removing 2 locations will help a bit. It does feel tremendously overly long to me though. I just went through my 3 separate video files I have for this, one where I stopped to ask for rules clarification about this, one where it was a brief update about the rules so I could get right back into the game whenever I resumed playing, and then the finish of the game. My total playtime in two-handed was 3 hours. Like a 4-player team that's arguing about how the rules work could conceivably run this at 5 hours. 3 hours in 2-player is insanely long. Another quick note is we have the Mensis Lift and the Branching Corridors. These both give you the ability to reveal 3 locations instead of 2, but they're not phrased the same. Now, as an additional cost to enter an empty space from Mensis Loft, you must pay 2 resources. They are different. This one is definitely a worse location. It doesn't get you a clue. Branching Corridors is better. But the important thing here is when choosing your destination from the Nightmare of Mensis deck at this location, draw an additional card. Versus, you may draw 1 additional card from the Nightmare of Mensis deck to choose from when moving to an empty space from Branching Corridors. These should just be phrased the same, and I don't really like either phrasing, so I'm suggesting a change to the phrasing of the rule as well. These should both simply be phrased as, when moving into an empty space, reveal an additional card from the Nightmare of Mensis deck. Whatever phrasing you pick, just have it be the same on both cards. In addition, I would break this line off of the force text into a separate effect, so it's very obviously visually identical to the other effect. I guess it's not technically the same, right? This one forces you to draw an additional card, as opposed to may draw an additional card. I don't really see a point in that. I would just go ahead and go back with what I was saying, make them identical. The more things you have that are slightly different but don't really matter, the more the mental load gets, and the more you can do to reduce that, the better. So having 2 very similar locations like this, I don't think is particularly helpful. I'm fine with just having the only difference being that this one costs you some resources. Another location that I need to talk about is Bergenworth. When it enters play, each investigator drops player clues on the location. For every clue they cannot drop, put a clue on their location from the token bank. That's exponential player scaling. Every player does something player times. This is 1 clue for 1 player, and it's 16 clues for 4 players. That doesn't seem good. I've never seen exponential player scaling in any other campaign. Probably shouldn't be a thing. I think investigators as a group must drop player clues on their location would be fine. And I think each investigator must drop 1 clue on their location, and then for each clue they cannot put a clue on their location from the token bank would also be fine. But exponential player scaling is really, really scary, and it's probably not a thing for a good reason. There's just a little bit left to say before we get in to the encounter sets. In Act 3, it has forced each mirror chamber gains the following ability. There's no reason to have this. You start the scenario, you're getting clues, you realize you don't know why you're getting clues. Have it be here immediately. Have all the mirror chambers have an action ability, and then before the colon, it's arrow if it is Act 3, colon. So if it's not Act 3, you cannot do this. And then it has that ability. People are like, oh, we need clues to shatter locations. I wonder what that's about. And it's a hook that makes your players understand they're playing right and they just don't have full information yet. That's way better. It makes this more obvious. It makes the clues more obvious. It removes some text on this already high text card. Moving this to the mirrors themselves is nothing but good. You know how I said my playthrough took 3 hours? I was so happy when we finally got to the end of this that I just flipped it over. There's actually just like an act I didn't touch. Like, I didn't resolve any of this stuff. Apparently, Mikolash has another side with Victory, too. I should have had even more experience than I did. My team's insane at fighting. We could have killed... Whoa, that's a lot of health. But if you killed him a lot, it's not. And I would not have seen any of that, I think. He'd have either had 1 or 0 player scaling. I love this art. I love his hat getting in the way of the card. I love triple horror damage. Which leads to another criticism I have for this scenario. This scenario has, like, almost no physical damage. I was terrified of dying on skids because I could not damage my coat. I just kept taking horror damage and nothing but horror damage. It's very far tilted towards horror damage to the point that it's like just very dangerous and kind of a problem. I do like that there's a boss fight with Mikolash. It like seems like there should be, but oh well. I'm not too beat up about not killing him a 5th time. Now, before we talk about the encounter deck, I want to say there's a low recognition deck with 36 cards. And a high recognition deck with 49. It might be necessary to remove some cards on the high recognition variants, which is unfortunate because it means more text than setup. But the fact is that a 50 card encounter deck is, I think, bigger than what you see in the penultimate scenario to Dunwich where you're climbing the hill. This encounter deck is just fucking huge. Coming over to the unique cards of this encounter set, you have the Winter Lanterns, and I love them. I really, really like them. Aloof Hunters, 1/4/1, spawn far from you, they come to you, and at the end of the enemy phase, if it's ready, it's going to take 2 horror. Or sorry, each investigator at its location is going to take 2 horror. I'm not sure there's a rule in the game that says an enemy that does no damage doesn't attack. So I think maybe rules as written, this creature will always attack even if it's engaged with you. So I think rules as written, if you engage with this guy, it can be dragged around and it never does anything because it hits you in the enemy phase and exhaust. I would change the phrasing to be at the start of the enemy phase or after the hunter's move step of the enemy phase instead. Yeah, I would do it directly before the enemy's attack step of the enemy phase. If Winter Lantern is ready, each investigator at Winter's location takes 2 horror instead. Because at the end of the enemy phase, technically, even though it has 0 in its stat, it does attack and exhaust. That means that technically the card doesn't work, so you need a slightly wordier version. It sucks, but it's true. Frenzy has Revelation, test 4 head. If you fail and have 3 or more horror, take 1 damage. If you have less than 3 horror, take a direct horror, and this card gains Surge. I'm completely fine with this card, honestly. This is like a relatively minor damage card, and if you haven't taken the horror, then it's going to be much harsher on you because the scenario mostly gives you horror. So if you're doing really, really well, it's going to gain Surge if you failed. I actually just really like the design of Frenzy. And Hunter's Lullaby is a really cool card. I think that it shouldn't have Surge at the front. The reason I think it shouldn't have Surge is because of a wording thing. I think if it has Surge, you're already just like going to get the Surge effect. I think a better way for it to be phrased to have the rules work the way it's supposed to is choose 1 and then you get the little 2 pips. And one says spawn the Winter Lantern at your location instead of its usual spawn condition. And the other pip says gain Surge. And at the bottom, if you cannot spawn a Winter Lantern, resolve each Winter Lantern's hunter keyword instead. That seems perfectly fine. But this does need a slight rules tweak because I think if it has Surge, you're already drawing the second card. I don't know if Revelation or Surge goes first, but to avoid that bit of confusion, and because the choose 1 pips just looks really nice, I would go with that. But on the whole, I really like this set. Now, moving up to the Mensis set itself, the Mensis Puppet spawns in an adjacent location, and I don't know if that includes empty space or not. That needs to be clarified in the rules because the rules are clearly copy-pasted from Black Throne and it causes some confusion. Because it patrols the nearest empty space, if possible, and it's aloof, I think the intent is that it doesn't spawn in the empty space and then patrols to the empty space. So I do think that it's supposed to not consider empty space to be a location. The issue with that phrasing then is that the adjacent location is just always going to be behind you until the end of the game, so they're likely going to spawn behind you and do nothing until they walk into you and then you kill them. But as far as aloof action tax enemies go, which is what this is intended to be, it's a really cool one. I really like this guy. Even though he's not a big problem, like there's 3 of them, he's not supposed to be a huge problem. I really dislike Through the Looking Glass, and the reason for that is because like moving him 2 locations away from investigators is perfectly fine, especially in Act 4 or Act 3 rather, when there's a big map and he's always able to do it. But if you cannot move him 2 locations, it doesn't say move him 2 locations, it just says cannot, but that means that you cannot do the entire above effect. Put him into play at the furthest mirror chamber from all investigators. So it's very, very likely that in the 3rd part where you have the big L, he can be up here like he just spawned, you get this card, you're all right here, you're pushing towards him, you were here a second ago, the act started, you moved up, he's here, you get this card, he just teleports to the opposite side of the map. Instead of being 1 or 2 locations away, he's 6 locations away now, and there's nothing you can do about that. So I think this second line shouldn't be here at all. All it does is create situations out of the player's hands where Mikolash just teleports across the map. If he isn't moved by this effect, would be able to do a similar thing. But I think he virtually will always be able to move at least 1 location, right? He's never going to voluntarily go to the mirror chamber. Even when he spawns, he immediately moves off of it before the Mythos phase. So I don't think this last line does anything except to make the game terrible by making an already long scenario extravagantly longer. I never drew this, and my playthrough was 3 hours without the final boss fight. That final boss fight might have only been 3 minutes, but still, this just serves to make a very long scenario longer. I would remove this last bit of text. And you can see what I'm talking about when I say there's a trend of just like all the cards having peril in this set at this point, because Majestic Prayers and Looking Glass both have it. Anyway, Majestic Prayer says deal 2 horror to everyone. I don't know what otherwise means here. Like, what's the otherwise? Is it supposed to be or? Because there's no otherwise. He attacks every player in order. There's no otherwise. If this is or remove 1 resource token from the scenario card, then the card's completely fine. But as it's written now, otherwise doesn't trigger, and the first one's just insane. Or it's Ancient Evils. So in my playthrough, this was just Ancient Evils. Like, there wasn't even a brief consideration of taking 2 horror on everyone in a high horror scenario. Anyway, if it is or remove 1 resource token on the scenario card, that should just be its own thing. It should be he attacks you, or you remove a token from the scenario card, or place 1 Doom Ancient Evils. Now, coming up to our Surge cards for the scenario, we've got the Nightmare Swirls. Surge, test 3 head. If you fail, shuffle the closest empty location back into the Nightmare of Mensis deck and replace it with empty space. This is a great example of what I'm talking about, where you can shuffle victory locations into the deck after completing them. And like, it's just sort of out of your hands, especially at the start of the scenario. If you draw this card, you might just lose victory randomly and it's no fun. So I would definitely include a Hanger Claw somewhere if you would shuffle a victory location back into the deck that has been cleared of clues, instead put it out of play in the victory display. Anyway, if you cannot do that, take 1 horror and gain Surge. It already has Surge, it can't gain Surge again. There's no double Surge. Coming over to the Nightmare Churns, it has Revelation, the closest investigator, test 4 head to Mikolash. If you fail, move away from him. If he's out of play, put him into play next to the agenda deck instead. And then force, if there are 3 cards next to the agenda deck, add 1 Doom, discard all copies. This is Ancient Evils. Alright, this is a 49 card deck, or something like that, right? It might have been 47. You have to draw all 3 of these while he's out of play to get that second effect to go off. There's no need to go through like all this extra rigmarole to Ancient Evils us. If he's out of play, Ancient Evils, or if he's out of play, put him back in. This is like a whole lot of text to say remove this card from the game and do nothing else. And lastly, we have the Mensis Ritual, which is actually a card I love. It attaches to the location with the most clues. At the end of the Mythos phase, place 1 Doom on this. If there are no clues in the attached location, discard Mensis Ritual. So if you're just like running past the clues like an idiot, this is gonna be like many copies of Ancient Evils. You gotta go back and get rid of this. As far as Doom variants go, I think this is one of my favorite Cultist cards I've ever seen. This is essentially just a Cultist, but it's an event, it's a Hex, instead of a Cultist, instead of a guy, and I really like it. And with all of that said, we're finally done talking about A Call Beyond. All that's left is Scenario 7, Communion. And let's start with the encounter cards, as I have a bone to pick, damn it. There's only 1 unique encounter set for this scenario before you get to the bosses. It's only got 6 cards, they're all enemies. And when it comes to Laurent Silverbeast, I just have 1 question. Who hurt you? Why did you do this? It's a 2/4/3 enemy, that's a lot of health but not a big deal, especially for a 7th scenario. It's Hunter and only hits for 1/1, it's just not a big deal so far. What line of text could it have that's so bad? As an additional cost to perform a fight action against this enemy, you must choose and discard 1 card from your hand. So provided you aren't using a flamethrower, you don't have a vicious blow, there's not really many ways in the game to hit for 4 damage. You usually have a fighter that's hitting for 2 or 3. This card requires you to discard at least 2 cards to kill him. Then, combined with curse shenanigans and autofails, it may be more than that. In my case, I only autofailed against these guys once, but this is just a normal enemy in the encounter set. There's 2 copies of him. And killing him requires you to discard 2 cards. That's much more than like any other enemy. Like, you see this guy? Killing him requires me to pull from the bag. This guy? Pull from the bag. This guy? Discard 2 cards. Maybe 3 or 4, depending on how bad your RNG is. This effect is incredibly scary. Maybe that's okay, maybe that's the point, but I would suggest at least 1 change to it. After performing a fight action against this enemy, you must discard 1 card from your hand. You might need like the line, even if it kills Laurent Silverbeast or something in there. I don't know how other cards with that sort of phrasing from the official scenarios work. But as it stands, if your fighter runs out of cards, he has 1 card in his hand, and he sees this guy, he literally cannot kill it. He cannot pay the cost to attack it. And I was in that situation. I had a Skids attacking it up 3. There are -4s and -5s and curses and autofails. And I was like, I've only got 2 cards in my hand. I can't even try to kill it for Diana, because if I do, I could just pull a bad token, fail to kill it, and discard my whole hand, and it's still alive attacking me now. This card is incredibly scary, and it's probably meant to be so, but it feels a little bit too far. Now, Bloodlicker's a chump, a 4-fist, 2 health enemy in Scenario 7. I don't even care what text it has. Like, I might. There's clearly text you could have put there that would have scared me, but not on this one. This guy's a complete chump. I am less scared of this guy than I am of a 2/2/2 ghoul in Scenario 1. Coming from the Lost Shot of Antiquity, I played this card wrong. And I still thought it was awesome. And now that I'm reading it right, I think it's even better. The card's not phrased poorly. The card's phrased correctly, and I'm just an idiot. So this is an enemy with a revelation effect, and it's really cool. It's a 3/2/1, so it's a chump and it's a hunter. It is revelation, test foot 4. If you fail, take 1 horror and 1 damage, disengage with each non-beast enemy engaged with you, and move to a central location. This is the On Wings of Night card, whatever it's called, the Mythos Night Gaunt set that you get with the core set. There's a card where you test 4 foot. If you fail, take 1/1, disengage from all enemies, move to a central location. It has revelation at that, but it specifies non-beast, and it is a beast, so it comes with you to the location. And then in addition, it's also just like a 3/2/1 hunter. Like, he's not very scary as an enemy, but this card is terrifying for your clue roots. This is the right kind of scary. I think this is too scary. I think this isn't scary at all. Lost Shout of Antiquity is an awesome way for a card to be scary. I love this guy. This is my favorite Night Gaunt card, including the official scenarios, because he's very clearly just a Night Gaunt card, and I love him. Now, coming into the scenario, it looks like it's set up correctly this time. Like with previous setups, there can be a glitch where some locations don't come down. I think for me, these 3 locations were encounter cards and one of the guidance cards. I don't know why that keeps happening, but it can happen here as well. Now, coming into Act 7 Communion, there's one minor gripe I have here. Coming over to the Eastern Cathedral, you can see its bottom ability, pay X resources, search the top X cards of your deck for a card and draw it. If a weakness is revealed by this effect, draw it as well. Searching isn't revealing. You want to copy the phrasing from Mr. Rook on this. The phrasing from Mr. Rook being, search the top 9 cards of your deck for any card and draw it. If at least one weakness is among the searched cards, draw them as well. So you definitely want to change the phrasing to match that. Now, coming into the scenario, you get 3 act decks. Act 1 is all in play at the same time, and you choose which act you want to pursue. Once you progress to Act 2 in any of these, you're going to just remove the other 2 from the game. And you'll see right here, there are 3 different things you can spend clues to replace this location with. And it's very obvious immediately that if you go in the cardinal directions, each of these places has an ability where you're going to switch them with one of the cards over here, according to whatever it is you want to do. It feels like this could be a little bit more elegant, though it's not really coming to mind how so. Like, if you're just picking an act and not doing the other 2 anyway, you should just pick which act you're doing before the scenario and only get the locations that are relevant. But I'm not sure if that's right. It just feels a little bit inelegant and a little bit clumsy. But I do like it. I was a little bit sad when I realized I wasn't playing Threads of Fate, but I do like everything about this scenario, generally speaking. It's just tight, good Arkham. One setup note that I do need to give, you will notice that when I give out my face down keys, only one of them is actually face down. Just a small setup thing that needs to be fixed. Now, whenever you finish Act 1, you're going to have a bunch of stuff get added to your sets. It's all going to be having to do with which act you're going down, whether you're fighting Murgo or Lady Maria or the Brain of Mensis. Personally, I think that we can cut down some of the text here by just making the set-aside keys start and play. We can just have the keys start in the corners. There's no problem with doing that. Like, if these were here originally, the problem would be pretty simple, which is when we put down a new location, it's going to say, it's going to say, spend your clues and a yellow key, remove a seal from Astral Clock Tower. So the concern is there's no Astral Clock Tower, you can't use this stuff properly, but players might waste it. Just have it include the words, if it is Act 2, comma, spend player clues and the yellow key, remove a seal from the Astral Clock Tower. And then we have like one extra little bit of wording on these lightning bolt abilities. It's not very complicated. But in exchange, these all start in play. Players immediately understand how it works. You don't have to backtrack through it. You can cut down your massive Doom counter because we currently need 23 Doom. I didn't need that much time, and this scenario can be made faster by letting us get these at the start. And it can be made more intuitive by allowing the players to see what's happening quicker. So I would like to see the keys starting in play instead of being set into play by this. And then to solve the problem, you just add some text here saying it has to be Act 2 to use this lightning bolt. Or sorry, to use this action ability. That's basically all my gripes with the scenario. I just feel like it runs a little bit long. And I think it could be faster and more intuitive if the keys started in play. And there are a couple of minor wording things, but let's move on to the encounter sets where we probably have more to say. That statement might be confusing. What do you mean, let's move on to the encounter sets? Well, you see, this is a scenario with a lot of different ways it can play out. And we have very, very many different additions we could be making to the deck. You can see that there are actually a bunch of cards you can add to the encounter sets. I think I would like to see a little bit more going on with the non-Lady Maria variants, because apparently only Lady Maria gets the boss fight encounter set. Murgo's Wet Nurse just attacks you, and the Spire of Mensis is added, but there's no encounter set. I don't know if that's necessarily bad, but I was a little bit surprised when I just opened these up and found out that only Lady Maria gets a boss fight encounter set. But we're gonna go look at the others and see how I feel about them. It will be entirely theoretical, I haven't gotten to play with them. Lady Maria is about as scary as a non-massive boss enemy can be. She has 5/4/5 as her base, Alert, Retaliate, she gets 3 player scaling health, she's not moving, you can't make her. And then forced at the end of the Mythos phase, you will discard cards until you draw an attack treachery and resolve it. She hits for 2/2 as well, and then you shuffle in these 3 attacks. Visceral Embrace goes in front of Lady Maria, or sorry, goes in your threat area if you're close to Lady Maria, and then when the deck runs out of cards, which she'll do pretty fast, she immediately slaps you. If not, you discard your whole hand. And if you can find the time somehow, you can use a double action to get rid of it. But yeah, it's just a scary card. And that seems like a scary card. Canehurst Inheritance goes next to the Agenda deck, and everyone at the same location, Maria takes a direct damage and then plus an additional damage for every asset they control with health. You can test Foot 3 to evade to get rid of this, which is really nice. This is just like the kind of card I want to see for a scary boss encounter card. I'm pretty happy with this one. Scarlet Waltz is going to attach to locations investigators are at. If you can't do that, if they're already all in play at locations with Scarlet Waltz, then you just resolve the other Scarlet Waltz effects. And at the end of the round, each investigator at a Scarlet Waltz location takes 2 damage or 2 horror. And if it doesn't do anything somehow, then put a Doom on the agenda. And then afterwards, discard Scarlet Waltz. So I really like all 3 of these. They weren't very scary for me because Lady Maria died in 1 turn. You might say she has 4+3 player scaling health. That seems unreasonable. My team was Parallel Skids and Diana Stanley with Cyclopean Hammer, and the Parallel Skids was the main fighter. Like, the Cyclopean Hammer was the quote-unquote flex. We had, like, the best fighting per capita of any team. Lady Maria got stomped, and it's not like Lady Maria's fault. 5 and 4+3 scaling is huge. She just didn't stand a chance, though. I think my team's enabled to lose to normal enemies. But this does look like a good boss fight. I think other teams would have a really good time with this, but I sort of skipped that entirely. If you're going down the Braid of Mensis path, you'll get the Lantern set again. You'll also get Church Assassin Brador. He's Victory 1. Hunter, he spawns, at locations, who cares? When you determine his movement during the enemy phase, he treats non-elite humanoid enemies as if they were investigators and attacks them. Neat, cool, like it. And if he begins the investigation phase, engaged with an investigator, or dealt damage to an enemy during the previous round, he cannot take damage until the end of the round. Okay, I find that last bit of force text absolutely horrifying. I don't know that I'm okay with that. I'll make a note that Church Assassin Brador seems really scary. Because like his effect just goes off if you're not able to deal with him immediately, right? If you're a team that struggled to kill him immediately, then his effect goes off, and now it's literally impossible to deal with him on the second turn. I feel like this is a really hard snowball against the players. You're also going to be getting 4 copies of Brain Rot. Test 4 head. If you fail, immediately move to the closest Yahargul location. Are there Yahargul locations by base? I imagine you're putting in 4 of them, right? That's what it's going to be. So it's going to throw you to a corner. Test 4 head, lose 1 action, basically, at worst. This is super soft. It's not a big deal. Don't really have an opinion on it. It might actually need to do more than this, because lose 1 action is about as weak as a Mythos card gets, and you're already taking a test to not even do that. So the Brain of Mensis has the text that can only be damaged by investigators at its location. What's that for? What's that do? Let me go look at all the Yahargul locations you would get from doing that route. Okay, I've looked at everything. As far as I can tell, cannot be damaged by investigators at other locations is just like a big waste of my time. I don't know what that's supposed to be stopping. There's nothing on the act, there's nothing on the locations. That's like usually the case, and if you are running a deck that lets you do this, it probably specifies non-elite already. And if it doesn't, then it's probably the point of your deck, and it's really mean to have the boss turn it off. So on the whole, I think that line of text is just useless and can be removed. And again, the same thing with the line about being moved unless explicitly told to. Like, it's a non-hunter massive enemy, it doesn't move anyway. So it seems like it has a lot of text that doesn't do anything. Anyway, the Brain of Mensis hits the entire board for 3 horror, and then if you're at its location, it hits you again for 3 horror. This hits for 6 horror per turn if you're fighting it. And it has players 10 health. And the act, I believe, gave you nothing to help with that, right? Yeah, just go kill it, just figure it out. I get the impression it's supposed to have the text doesn't attack. Even just like the base effect is scary, but like combine that with also just hitting everyone at its location, it's kind of wild. But I think if it were not attacking, I think that's very obviously a mistake. It's not supposed to attack in addition to this. As a heads up, if a monster attacks, that does not exhaust it. It's just a specific part of the attack step in the enemy phase that does it. So this forced effect does attack twice. Anyway, on the whole, I really like this. I like the idea of just like the huge chunky boss that hits for 3 horror, and that no matter where you are, it's like, no, you can still see the giant mess of eyes and brains. It's still there. I like the idea of the Brain Immenses a lot. I do think Braydor is overtuned and Brain Rot's undertuned, but I do really like this set as well. Last, we have Murgo's Wet Nurse, which 10+1 player scaling sounds like it sucks to be true solo. That's an immediate thought I have when I look at this. But it's a 4/10/4 Alert Retaliate Hunter. It's not massive, hits for 2/1. I really like its unique portrait. Anytime people do weird stuff with the art of the cards, I'm a big fan. Anyway, force at the end of the enemy phase, if it's ready, each investigator must draw a token from the Chaos Bag. Move Murgo's Wet Nurse to the location of the investigator that drew the token with the lowest negative modifier. That's really cool, man. That's a really unique way for it to move. It guarantees that it does move. It happens after the attack step, so it's not like potentially rug pulling the investigators and changing things up. Wait, no, sorry. At the end of the enemy phase, all enemies are exhausted. The effect doesn't work, so it needs to be changed. It just needs to be at the end of the enemy phase that this happens. You can't trip it to stop it, it just happens. Each ready, engaged enemy makes an attack against the investigator to which it is engaged. When an enemy attacks, deal damage and horror to the engaged investigator. Upon completion of dealing the attack, exhaust the enemy. So that would mean that Murgo's ability only triggers if you aren't fighting them. And like your goal is to fight them. You literally cannot win without going deal with them. So this basically would never trigger. Okay, I have a lot to say about Murgo's Wet Nurse, but I need to playtest it to be sure about anything. So I'm not going to say anything further. Because Murgo's Wet Nurse's ability is absolutely going off. Because All Wings of Black is ripping them across the map from you. They come in on Act 2, not Act 3 like the others. And in addition, when they come in, they spawn up here and not actually at the map, so it'll trigger immediately. So Murgo's Wet Nurse is a very different scenario than the other two, and I really like it. What happens if you kill Murgo's Wet Nurse? What's the final goal then? Okay, I have a lot to say about Murgo. I think I need to playtest them to be confident in this, but something does stand out to me. With Murgo, you have the Lunarium, and with the Lunarium, where did I just put it? You need to spend keys to get into it. Every version of the scenario, you do get keys and use them for something. But in Murgo's version of the scenario, correct me if I'm wrong, you just don't need to go to the Lunarium, right? In Act 2, you start Act 1, right? In Act 1, Murgo goes and plays next to the Agenda and Act deck. They're going to come attack you pretty immediately. So they're going to interplay at a location, like the next turn guaranteed, right? So you immediately advance this act no matter what. And then your next objective is if Murgo's Wet Nurse is defeated, advance, and that just means you have to kill the boss. So like all this shit with the keys doesn't actually matter, you just immediately leave, don't you? So like this is just a victory location that doesn't really matter and not the objective. And that feels a little bit weird, the Murgo route where you just like kill Murgo and end the scenario instantly and skip like 15 turns. I think the Murgo stuff looks really interesting, but I'm not convinced it actually works. I think this scenario has some jank that needs to be ironed out. There's a lot of stuff in this scenario that feels like it just gets skipped over because you kill Murgo and the scenario ends. Because there's like no text saying you can't kill Murgo, right? Yeah, no, this is just a little bit janky, a little bit broken, but I will comment on Merciless Watchers. They are 2/2/4 Hunters swarming 2. They only hit for 1, but of course there are 3 of them, and they're going to double hunt, as we have so often seen in the past, where they move twice but they don't attack if they did need to move the second time. It's Scenario 7, this is supposed to be a scary enemy. I would not mind seeing these guys have 3 health each. Like, they only hit for 1 each. If they move into you, that's scary, but that's very easy to avoid. You should still be able to move in and kill at least one of them very reliably as a fighter at this point in time. I think these guys are a little bit undertuned. A thing I forgot to comment on earlier, Act 3C, the Absolution of Lady Maria, does not have a timing window on the reaction. This ability right here, every reaction ability in the game has a timing window before the colon because it's part of the cost of the ability is being in that window. So it should say something like reaction when an investigator draws an attack treachery, comma, if you are at a hospital location or while you are at a hospital location, and then colon, test for book or head. If you succeed, cancel that treachery. So that just needs its timing window specified and its phrasing reordered to do so. I can't believe I almost forgot that this set, the Agents of Cause set, gets shuffled in as well when you're going down the Maria path. And I've only actually seen 2 of these. I never saw Mother's Mercy or Grief. So first, let's talk about the Baneful Maiden, because it's the card I like the most out of the set. I don't know why I like it so much. It's just like a basic chumpy enemy. It's a 2/1/2 aloof. When it enters play, it takes an insight from the bag. If it can't, it puts a doom on the agenda, and it's Ancient Evil. So you have to deal with these guys, because they'll start just being Ancient Evils. Additionally, having some insight but not all the insight is terrifying, and that's just like a thing that keeps happening in these later scenarios that I really, really enjoy, is being scared of having insight tokens out of the bag. Or inversely, being scared of not having enough. Just no matter what you're doing with your Eldritch Knowledge, it's terrifying and bad. And then force, when you kill it, you put the insight token into the display, which can give you a level of recognition. I just really like the Baneful Maidens. They seem really, really cool and thematically appropriate to me. They are probably one of my favorite cards in the set. As with all the other sets, in Act 2 you get an elite card in your encounter deck. It's the Fishing Hamlet Goliath this time. He's huge, 3/6/3, hits for 2 meat, Hunter, Retaliate, and Massive. He spawns at 1 of 2 locations. I think all of these guys, the 2 locations they spawn at, have differing text that change the way the card works a little bit. And by definition, if this guy's in the encounter set, you can see those, they'll have been revealed already. So that's all very tightly designed. I tend to find that those locations don't change them too much, and it's kind of just like a little bit of complexity for complexity's sake, but it's not necessarily bad, and I might just being overly cynical about it. But as forced, each time it resolves its Hunter keyword, seal a random token from the Chaos bag on it. That's really funny. I love the idea that this guy seals the autofill on him, and you're like, no, we have to keep tripping him, we can't kill him. Not until we're about to win. The second we're about to win, we're killing him, he's victory 1. I like the weird play patterns this guy can cause with his ability. I like big enemies that just throw a wrench in the works. I like small enemies that throw a wrench in the works. Anything that makes you look at it and go, huh, that's not good, right? And I feel like Fishing Hamlet Goliath is a really interesting spot for an enemy to be in, where it's very threatening, but it can potentially become either super threatening because it seals good tokens, or something you need to keep alive because it seals really bad tokens. I really like this guy too. I'm really surprised I never saw Mother's Mercy or Grief. Apparently there's 5 of these in the encounter set. I had to reread this because this was a roller coaster. I fucking love this card. This is just one of my favorite encounter sets, period. At this point, unless Grief's the worst card in the world, this is a wonderful encounter set. This is the best Crypt Shield. You attach a negative chaos token from the bag to one of your assets. And then you get a positive modifier on any test with that asset equal to the negative value. Yeah, that's right. Put your -5 on the shotgun. It's got +5 and there's no -5 in the bag anymore. Also, at the end of your turn, test Brain X, where X is the value on that token. If you fail, add 1 Doom to the agenda, Ancient Evils, this can cause it to advance. You want to get rid of this? That sound like a problem? Discard the asset, say bye to the shotgun. This is in the design space that Blood Drunk is in, where you have a problem, where you're getting something really valuable, but is it worth the trade-off? And with Blood Drunk, I felt like it crippled my ability to do my job, and it didn't really do anything for a lot of people. But with this, I feel like it absolutely hurts everyone. Everyone's afraid of this test. Everyone gets the benefit. This is a much better iteration on the Blood Drunk design space. I really like this card. And Grief is a peril. Revelation, seal a token on this. So that's generally the theme of this entire set. It's all token sealing, but very different on each of them. Anyway, you seal a token on Grief and put it in your threat area. It's a random token just pulling from the bag. The next time you draw a Chaos token has the same modifier as the token sealed on Grief, or is the same as that token, add 1 Doom to the agenda. This Doom may cause the agenda to advance. This says the next time you draw a Chaos token that does that. I assume it's supposed to have the text at the end, discard Grief. Otherwise it stays in play but never does anything ever again. I like Grief. This is an interesting and weird way to muck up the works. It's Ancient Evils in a format that it's never been even close to before. It's Ancient Evils with Peril, which is always funny to me, since everyone loves to ward Ancient Evils. I think this is one of the more appropriate uses of Peril in the set. I really like this set. I'm so glad that I caught that I didn't review it, because it would be a shame if I didn't gush about this in the video. And while I'm stopping the video, it's a very long video, it's all feedback. The majority of it is, this could be improved, this seems bad, I didn't have fun with that. Most of the feedback is by definition about the things that attract my attention by detracting from the whole. But just because the video is fundamentally negative, I'm going to take the moment to say this. I really enjoyed this campaign. I can see it being like on par or better than most of the actual official campaigns. Like, I can't imagine that when this is finished, I would rather play Dunwich. This is going to be better than Dunwich, fucking guaranteed. I really like this campaign, and it's not just I like it because it has a lot of promise, I liked it as it is. And I'm very confident in the future it will be a very, very good custom campaign. Anyway, back to past me to wrap up this feedback video. Before I move on to the event cards and the sets that I haven't gotten to talk about yet, let's talk about the rewards for Scenario 7. I obviously can only talk about these in theory because there's no Scenario 8 yet. I'm going to start with the one that I've looked at the most, the Rikuyo. This is what rogue weapons should be. The Rikuyo is a 4-cost 2-hand slot melee weapon. It fights at +2 for 2 damage. You may exhaust it once a turn before you draw the chaos token to get 1 extra damage. And it has a built-in copy of Dirty Fighting as well. So yeah, it's just really, really nice. This is what rogue weapons need to be considered. And in my Skids deck, I wouldn't have taken this. My hand slots are full, I was good enough at fighting, I didn't need this. But I'm happy with where the Rikuyo is, definitely. The Queen Stone is a 0-cost, slotless asset that gives you 2 health soak. And when you would take a horror, you can exhaust this and cancel that horror to take a damage instead. There is nobody that needs a Scenario 7 story asset to do this. If you're this afraid of horror damage and this good at soaking normal damage, you figured out the solution to horror a long time ago. Like, you made it to Scenario 7. You can't still not have a solution to that by this point in the game. So like the problem it's solving just doesn't exist. This is a 4-1 Chord of the Eye. It does the same thing as all the other Chords of the Eye. It's a story thing. I don't really have a comment on it. The Carol Rune for Moon is a fast arcane slot asset for 2 resources. During any skill test, you can exhaust this, reduce your recognition by 1 and get unexpected courage. Like, don't get me wrong, that is unexpected courage every turn of the game in the final scenario once recognition no longer matters. But as a general rule, I dislike things that are reducing my recognition level for benefits, because like, you're meant to be able to beat the scenario without it, right? You don't need Carol Rune Moon to beat the scenario, so you could have done it without lowering your recognition, which is why I'm not a big fan. So of the lot, Rikuyo is the only one that I really have a strong opinion on. I think the other 3 are all, to some degree, underwhelming. Again, I'm going to zoom in here on like everything I did in this campaign. I found out what I've missed and the other stuff. We grossly over-exceeded both tally checks at 19 of 9, it might have been a 10, and 15 of 10, it might have been a 9. I might have just had the secondary numbers wrong. Like, we absolutely crushed both tally counts. And you can see we got huge amounts of experience. Our final recognition is at 27. We ate 3 of the chords. We spent 1 on an amygdala. And yeah, I was very happy with the campaign as a whole. I had a good time, even though like there were some things that needed fixing. I signed up for that. I'm alpha testing. I knew that would be there. So before we wrap up, there's encounter sets. We have 6, 8, 7, 7, 7, 7, 8, 8, 5, 6, 6, 8. That seemed like a large quantity, didn't it? We have 83 cards by my count. So let's go through them. Let's talk about the encounter sets that you'll see in multiple scenarios. There's one we don't need to talk about. I mistakenly believe the Church Behemoth set was unique to the chapel, but it's not. So we've already seen these 4 cards earlier. I do like this set. This is a very scary card, but I think it's a good kind of scary. And then these are ordered by the first time you see each set. So we're going to be starting with the earlier sets, moving into the later ones as we go. Let's start with the ones you see as early as Scenario 1. With the Hunt set, you have 3 copies of Hunting Party, 3 copies of Hounds, 2 copies of View Halloo. View Halloo is a foot test. If you fail, the Blood Drunk enemies resolve their Hunter keyword. If there are no Blood Drunk enemies, then you discard cards until an encounter deck, from the counter deck until one's revealed, and then you spawn it at a connecting location. I like this in theory, but it needs to say not if there are no Blood Drunk enemies in play, but if no Blood Drunk enemies move as a result of this. Why? Because if you are engaged with a Blood Drunk enemy, its Hunter keyword does nothing, but it is still in play, so it fails to trigger the secondary effect like it should. But on the whole, I really like View Halloo. I love the foot test to get enemies on a fight-heavy campaign. I really like it. Then we have 2 different small swarming enemies. Blood Crazed Hounds, in my experience, have always been a 2-1-3, where X is just the 2 that it spawns with. And then Hunting Party is just a 3-1-3 swarming one. They're both Hunter. They both hit for 1 damage, but they're swarming, so it's gonna be more than that. And if you get attacked by Hunting Party, everything else hunts. I think these are just like basic chumpy swarm enemies, nothing more, nothing less, and I like them. View Halloo and the sheer quantity you see make the scenarios they're in really cool. And then next up, we have Dreadful Effigy. Forever Effigy attaches to your location. To get rid of it, you have to either spend 2 player resources or place a doom on the agenda, and then once you do that, it goes away forever. It's a cost to leave, it's not like an action you do or anything. So, honestly, I really like this card. As far as an Ancient Evils variant go, this one isn't even Ancient Evils, you just place the doom. I think this is a really cool card, we haven't seen much like it before, and I like it. It's 1 per set, it's not even a 2 of, so I think it's in a pretty good place. Next we have Arkham Hospitality. Like many cards, it just sort of randomly has peril tacked on. Test foot or forehead. If you fail until the end of the round, take 1 damage each time you investigate or parlay. This is essentially, if you are a Clover and you can't pass a Mythos test reliably, either stat, then you get punished. My problem with this card is pretty much entirely that it does nothing if it hits a fighter. And that's a common complaint I've had with many of the weaknesses in Mythos cards in the set so far. A lot of them do 1 thing to a fighter or 1 thing to a Clover, and then nothing to the other. This one, if you're a Clover, you're fated. If you're a fighter, you laugh. You just got a free Mythos face. And Ashen Affliction is a really, really feels bad card. Most of the time it does nothing. -1 health, -1 foot, mill the top card of your deck. It doesn't check for weaknesses, so it can hit weaknesses just as much as other cards. And test head 3 if you succeed, discard this. So like, for most characters, lose a health and a foot doesn't even really matter to you. The only foot checks are checks to stop fighting anyway, so it's not a big deal. But for rogues, this tests the skill they can't test to get their primary skill back. So they need someone else to get it for them, and if no one on your team is good at getting rid of this, this can just sort of cripple rogues. In addition, I find milling your deck to not really do anything. In my playthrough and off the channel, when we've drawn this, we have forgotten to do this a couple of times, but mill your deck with no additional penalty, that's just take 0.05 horror, right? Like take 1/20th of a horror every time you get a card because you're just getting closer to that 1 horror for deck cycle, right? I think you could have this exact same card without the milling effect, and it would still hurt rogues disproportionately more than everyone else, but it would be a lot easier to keep track of things, it would reduce the mental load. And really, the thing it does now doesn't have much of a game impact anyway. And that's it for this set, so moving on to the set that Slake the Thirst is in. I don't know the names of any of these. Tabletop Simulator set it up for me, so I never learned anything. Moving on to the next set, we have the Sweet Stench. This is a card that does nothing. Test 3 head. If you fail, this goes in your threat area, and all humanoid enemies gain Prey U. The Prey effect might trigger once per scenario, if that. Not this Prey effect, any Prey effect. Like, you don't see this effect very much. This is a test 3 head. If you fail, nothing happens. If you pass, nothing happens. The idea that anyone would ever spend 2 actions to discard this is laughable. This is one of the softest Mythos cards in the game, and I'm happy every time I draw this, but I feel like it's supposed to do something, and it doesn't. Slake the Thirst is a card I absolutely love. It's the same thing as seeing Shadows from the Paladin Mask, and that was a great card, and this is a great card. It's an action tax, and if you keep paying it, nothing happens, but if you stop paying it, then Slake the Thirst goes away, but you deal 2 damage to somebody. Maybe it's 1/1 to an ally, maybe it's 2 to you, maybe it's 2 horror to you, but somebody somewhere is taking some combination of 2 soak. And I really, really like this. This is a really cool Mythos card, and I love everything about it. Unlike Blood Drunk. Blood Drunk has the possibility that you draw both copies on your fighter, and they literally cannot do their job at -4 fist, and they get unlucky, and they're not able to deal with the 3 head test. They're just like a lot of rogues, where it's like, yeah, sorry, I didn't draw well connected, didn't draw, you handle this, can't do anything. And this happened to me. I eventually got through it, but -2 fist is enough to basically make you bad at your roll already. -4 is unmanageable. In addition, this literally does nothing to anyone who isn't a fist-based fighter. If you're playing a Mystic, or anything else that somehow allows you to fight with like foot or something, this just gives you +1 damage during fight actions at no penalty. So Blood Drunk only hurts fist-based fighters. It's a completely free Mythos card for everyone else. And in addition, it has the possibility that the fighter draws 2 copies of it. Like the force, if you deal damage to an enemy, next turn you only fight, evade, or move. If you're dealing damage to enemies, that's what your job is. Fighting, evading, and moving is what you want to do. It's also super easy to forget about. It's like the upper end of mental load. I'm very confident that if I didn't misplay this, it's just because I got lucky and it didn't come up that I could misplay it. I would like to see that revelation be limit 1, right? Like in parentheses afterwards, if you already have 1 copy of Blood Drunk in your threat area, this card gains Surge. I don't know how it's phrased on other cards. I can't think of one off the top of my head to get an example. But I'd like to see Blood Drunk phrased as one of those limit 1 per investigator cards where if you get a second one, it discards and you get Surge. Because the possibility of getting -4 to fight basically means you just stop doing your job entirely. And then it just fits in that same problem I've been talking about where The penalty it gives is only a penalty for fighters and has very swingy effects based on who draws it. Now, all that said, I think Blood Drunk's awesome. I got a point in the scenarios where I had one Blood Drunk and I really wanted to stay Blood Drunk, and I was sad when I pulled a +1 and got rid of it, right? I think what Blood Drunk is doing is actually really cool. I would like to see it as you get -2 on fight actions as opposed to -2 fist, so that it's not just asymmetrically affecting specifically fist-based fighters. I'd like to see its force effect not be forcing you to do stuff if you damaged an enemy. I would like to see its force effect be something like, I don't know, something else, something that affects cloovers. But it can't just like be you can't investigate, right? Because then it's testless, the clover can't clue for a turn. Maybe 2 if they get an autofill, right? So I don't know what this needs to be, but I want it to be something that affects cloovers. And that's it for Blood Drunk, which brings us to the Beast set. It's just a couple of wolves. We got 6 cards in the set. There should be another wolf here. It wasn't with this set when I grabbed it because it was in play, but there are 3 of both wolves. We have a basic 3/3/3 Hunter, Prey, lowest health wolf. It gets +1 fight for any other beast at its location. It only hits for 1/1. This wolf only hits for 1. It's 2x4. Its health is the number of beast enemies at its location, including itself. Very frequently saw this as 2/1/4. Spawn location with most beast enemies can be complicated later, but for most of the scenarios where it's in, that just means you pick where it spawns because there are no beast enemies in play. And obviously these things get a lot rowdier if you're losing control of fighting and running away, where you start losing control of our enemies are spawning, there's huge numbers of hunters running around. But in my experience, these were just like perfectly reasonable early game enemies that filled their roles correctly. I do think Ash and Blood Beast could afford to be, I don't know. It feels a little bit weak, but I think it's supposed to feel weak. It's supposed to feel like things are getting out of control if they are falling apart, and if they're not falling apart, it's supposed to be manageable. But it does stand out as feeling a little bit weak, but it's so minor that I'm not even taking a note of it in the Word doc. Moving on to the next set, we have Into Temptation, A Mere Bad Dream, and Blood Sacrifice. Blood Sacrifice says that you take 1 more damage anytime you take damage, but whenever you deal 2 or more damage in a single action, discard Blood Sacrifice. So on a Clover who cannot do that, this says you take 1 more damage anytime you take damage forever. And on a Fighter, you discard this instantly. So once again, this is a very asymmetrical effect where on Clovers it's horrifying and on Fighters it does nothing, and I would like to see it change to be less asymmetrical. I don't specifically have a suggestion here, I just want the way it discards to be something entirely different, where it's not only one type of character that gets rid of it. Then we have our Grasping Hands, Rotting Remains variants. They're both test 3 if you fail, take 2, and then they randomly gain surge depending on what tokens you draw, so please don't. I don't care how you make them interesting, but this is not a good way to make them interesting. Percent chance of surge is not a fun or interesting mechanic. There's no complexity or depth to it, it's just a thing that happens to you and it's not fun. Again, I don't have a specific suggestion on how it should be changed, but I do not want to see random chance at gaining surge ever. Especially on something where you're passing the test, right? It doesn't care about that. There's no then, so this is not one after the other. This is always active. Moving on to the next set of cards, we have the Burden of Knowledge. This is a peril test book 4 for each one you fail by to a maximum of 3. I would just go ahead and let that be to 4, like what's the difference? Put a clue from the token bank on your location or a connecting location. I've now played all the scenarios this was in, and I can confidently say I don't know what this card does. What's it matter? Because it's not specifically your location, it's never costing you victory or progress, right? Like you just throw it on a connecting location if you don't want it on your location. The Burden of Knowledge doesn't really do anything. Uncertainty, you can see, again, we've had Peril on both of these, and it doesn't really seem like it needs Peril. But Uncertainty is the one where I started noticing that Peril seemed a little bit randomly tacked onto stuff. It goes into your threat area. While it's in your threat area, each test you take gets +X difficulty, where X is the number of tests you've taken this round, including your current test. You have not taken a test or done anything yet. It has a double action to discard Uncertainty. If you actually go read the text on Peril, I'll take you over there. Peril specifically applies when drawing an encounter card. You cannot confer with other players, they cannot play cards, trigger abilities, or commit cards, none of their skill test, while the Peril encounter is resolving. That's ambiguous, but to me, the card's already resolved, right? It's not resolving forever while it's in play, it's just the revelation text. I don't think we've ever seen an official card where you had Peril in a threat area that just sat there. And with all the other Peril cards like this, they do attach to item assets, so they're not in your threat area and other people can't touch them, but this is just in your threat area. So from my understanding of the rules, somebody else could just get rid of this for you. And even if they can't, the Peril still seems very, very random. Now, as to what the card does, it gives you reverse quick learner, right? It's not really that scary. I think most characters can deal with it. It's a sort of soft Mythos card. And this encounter set made every scenario it was in easier because all of these are pretty soft. This does nothing. This does a little. It might cost you 2 actions if it becomes a problem. And Blessed with Eyes attaches the enemy closest to the investigator with the highest book. The attached enemy gains Hunter and gets +1 horror and +2 evade. There are no enemies in play, it gains Surge. So this doesn't really make them harder to kill. So either this gains Surge and doesn't do anything, or it attaches to a dude and I slap him and he dies just the same as he normally would. So Blessed with Eyes also feels quite soft. I will also note that it felt quite soft because I'm fighting normally. If I were using a foot-based fighter, like Kaimani, and this attached to a guy with a normal foot value, like 3 or 4, that would boost it to, let's go with the 4 guy, 6. It is unreasonably hard to evade a 6-foot enemy. Fighting a 6-fist guy is actually not that bad. Your asset will boost you up on the fight attempt, but there's no asset that boosts the evade attempt. You can boost your foot and your fight. There are beat cops and cat burglars, but there's only flamethrowers. Now there's Disguise. Disguise is the only thing that really boosts your evade number as part of the evade attempt to like parallel the fighter weapons. And +2 evade could be very, very scary on somebody who's relying on running away. So again, this is very asymmetrical. It might be very soft and do almost nothing, or it might be nearly crippling if your only option was to evade the guy to begin with. I believe we talked about this set because at some point in time I thought it was unique and I was incorrect. If not, quick opinions. This blanks your highest cost asset and costs you that number of resources again, which is very scary. This makes you pay resources equal to an enemy's fight value to attack them, and combined they run the risk of bankrupting your fighter. This is a cool card. It's sort of like Min's weakness for Cloobers. I really like Vision of the Marian Queen, but I worry these other two might be too much threat against your fighters. Like I can just see a Guardian going bankrupt in this scenario very fast. Remorse attaches to a card in your play area with an action trigger, and then as an additional cost to activate it, you have to discard a card from your hand. If you can't do that, then you take a direct horror and it gains Surge. I don't think that horror needs to be direct, that's just Calvin hate. As a general rule, and we're going to talk about this a lot more once we get to the specific hunters that you can fight, the Polite Exchange card. Gaining Surge because the card failed should always be a weaker effect than what the card normally does. Take a direct horror, draw an encounter card is, like if there was just an encounter card that said, take 1 direct horror, Surge, you would have a problem with that, right? So this having the potential to say that is problematic. Anyways, to get rid of it, you need to discard an you have to discard an asset in your play area to discard Remorse. I think this is like a fairly aggressively harsh card. This is like Crypt Chill, except you have to spend an action to get rid of it. You don't take a test to get the Crypt Chill, it just happens to you. And until you send that action, you can't resolve one of your card's action abilities. Usually that's basically just like your spell or your fight tool. It's the main thing you do, so you have to do this immediately. This is a substantially more aggressive Crypt Chill, and while I am okay with it personally, I think many other people might point this card out as being overpowered, and I don't necessarily think they're wrong. Fragment itself is Peril. You put your hand into 2 face-down piles in front of you, and it's going to be shuffling in random. I don't think you pick which is in what pile. Then you discard 1 pile, draw the other, and then draw cards equal to the number of cards discarded. If you can't, take 1 horror and discard gain Surge. So I guess if your hand is empty. Honestly, I wouldn't even include hanger text on Fragment itself. This is a minor thing I'm not even including in the text notes. But honestly, if your hand is just completely empty, if you're bottomed out on resources, you're already screwed. You can just go ahead and get a free Mythos card this turn. On the whole, I really dislike Fragment itself. It's a peril card, so no one can ward it for you. It says discard half the cards in your hand at random. Admittedly, you don't lose the resources. It only screws up your ability to plan, but this really punishes stuff like True Magic decks or a Nathaniel Cho that's fighting with events. For a lot of characters, this does basically nothing. For a lot of characters, this is really unpleasant in a very visceral way. It's not actually very bad in the grand scheme of things, like the power level of the card's not that high, but for a player, it's very unfun. And lastly, we have Curious Mania, which is a card that I found to be aggressively overpowered. Test 3 head, if you fail, choose a type of basic action and put Curious Mania in your threat area. As an additional cost, perform actions other than your chosen basic action. Randomly discard 1 card from your hand or pay 1 resource. So ideally, if you fail this, you're like a Clover and you say investigate, and this mostly doesn't affect you. But for like basically any other situation, you say fight, you kill your guy, you have 2 actions left. Now both of them cost a resource or a random discard. And it's got the Frozen in Fear test, which you could repeatedly fail, like I was talking about with Blood Drunk. It can just be a bad thing that happens to you sometimes. I know it's not a hard test, but it can. I think this card might be something that I personally hate that's at the right power level. I'm actually not going to make a note about it in the Word doc because I don't think it's like an objective criticism, and the Word doc is supposed to be like as detached and concise as possible, whereas this video is the big rambling thing where I make all my notes from. I think Curious Mania, for me, I hate this card. I despise it. But with the head test before, a head test every round, you're able to clear your main roll and pass. I think Curious Mania, I just drew and failed in a really bad spot where it just bricked my Diana and cost her like 5 resources early game. And maybe I could have played it differently. I think I have a more negative opinion of this card than it really is. I'm not going to make any notes about it. Now we get to read the Amygdala set. The Lesser Amygdala has infinite fight, 3 health, and 3 foot. But the 3 health shouldn't be there either because you cannot attack or deal damage to Lesser Amygdala. So its fist should be a blank and so should its health because you can't actually deal damage to it. It's aloof and it just hangs out at your location. As an action, you can reduce your recognition level in the campaign log to make them go away. And forced, if it's ready and you would either draw an insight token or investigate its location, it attacks you. I actually really like this card. I'm super averse to using its ability. I don't like spending recognition since it's a campaign resource. And it only shuffles into the deck, it doesn't even kill it. So I'm really averse to it. I usually just let these things go and go somewhere else, and eventually they'll move because of Eldritch Spectator. So I do think I like Lesser Amygdala. I think this is a set that on the whole I really enjoyed being in the game, even though it's actually kind of soft. Eldritch Spectator is a peril card. I don't really know that it needs to be a peril card. Search the encounter deck and discard pile for a Lesser Amygdala and spawn it at your location. Like, there's no decision making here. Peril just stops the ward, right? If all peril does is prevent ward protection, I think it shouldn't have been peril. Anyway, if there are no Lesser Amygdalas in the encounter deck or discard pile, which very frequently happens, you move the one furthest from you to your location. And again, that's not a decision unless they're tied for furthest from you, in which case it very likely is an easy decision, or the same decision even. And these go off all the time. These guys chase you down because you have 2 amygdalas and 3 of these. You'll see these guys very quickly. And lastly, we have the amygdalin measure. This goes in your threat area. While it's in your threat area, the 2 things you have to do to win the game, fight and investigate, cost additional actions. But then during upkeep, you can discard a random card from your hand. Instead of drawing a card, discard amygdalin measure. Now, because it's instead of drawing a card, that is basically discarding 2 cards at random, whatever you would have drawn, and then whatever you do discard. And this is testless, lose at least 1 action, basically. I think this card is very harsh. However, I also think the set it's in on the whole is very soft, and it makes it okay for this card to be so bad. The note I'm actually going to make is just I love the Amygdala set. And I'm not putting positive feedback in the Word doc, which I'm sure is great for the author's self-esteem, but like, I love this set. I have nothing bad to say about it, so it's not getting any notes. These last 2 sets are both sets you get for having high recognition in the final 2 scenarios. First, we have Apocryphal Understanding, Peril Surge. It's the poster child for there is too much peril and surge in this campaign. The first option puts an insight token in the chaos bag and the display, and then you take 2 horror. This can cause you to gain recognition. So the important part of that is you choose to take 2 horror. You don't do that. You take the other option, which is remove everything from the insight display and put it back in the bag. You can either take 2 horror or not take 2 horror. And it's a really easy choice every time. 2 horror is such a high amount. Like, every scenario in this campaign is fairly threatening. The idea of voluntarily taking 2 horror, especially when recognition is so easy to come by, it feels. It's just, I would never consider doing this. However, from a flavor perspective, there's something really important here that is why I don't want the card to change. As you get more recognition, you realize it's just terrible and you don't want any more. And you start being happy when you get insight tokens, because it means you can put them back, not learn anything, and avoid taking more horror. And I think that for Lovecraftian subjects, that is one of the best possible evolutions of the insight token you could ever have. I really like what this does from a flavor perspective. The Hypogean Snatcher is a 4/3/2 Retaliate Alert Hunter. How many do we have? We have 2%. Prey most ally assets, because he's just looking to kidnap. If he attacks you, you test foot forward. If you fail, he shuffles an ally asset in your play area back into your deck, or you remove an ally asset in your deck or discard pile from the game. He only actually hits for 1. The big thing he's doing is that test. Now, if isn't a clear timing window, and he's already shuffling your ally assets back into the deck anyway, so I would make this be phrased after he attacks you. And then I would have him deal 1 more heart damage, I think. That way you have a clearer timing window, and your allies can soak some of the damage for you and then get taken out or get killed and removed. It would make him a much more generally threatening enemy with slightly clearer text. We have Madman's Epiphany, Surge, Revelation Test X. X is the doom on the agenda. If you fail, take a damage or horror for each token in the insight display. This has Surge because it very frequently does almost nothing. A lot of the time you have 0 or 1 in the insight display, which means the worst case scenario is that you take 1 damage or horror, whichever one you're less threatened by. Very rarely you have 2 insight tokens in the display when you draw this. Test X head, usually in the scenarios this shows up in, the agendas are pretty short, with the exception of scenario 7 so far, that has been the case. So testing 1 to 3 is usually what you're seeing with this. It's just like never that big of a penalty and usually not that big of a test, so I think I'm fine with this card. I really like it. It's another way they're making you feel really bad about recognition. The game's just getting harder, you don't want it anymore, you realize you've made a mistake. And then Pale Blood Skies, Revelation Test 3 head. If you fail, you must choose 1. Drop X of your clues, where X is 2 more than the number of insight tokens in the insight display, or put this next to the deck and everyone cannot move from their location as long as there are clues on that location. And then one of these discard, max 1 per round. I just really like this card. This is a good, cool card. I love it. Nothing else to say about it. On the whole, I love this set. The only thing I would like to see is Hypogean Snatcher needs to be cleaned up a little bit, and he can be made more threatening in the cleanup process by letting you use allies for soak, making it after, and then giving him 1 more damage, making him read a little bit scarier. We're getting down to the end. We have this and the Hunters and the Milkweed Bosses. Unspeakable Truth is a 5-head test. If you fail, lose a resource or discard a card from your hand for each point you failed by, and if you can't do either, take 1 horror. This is a fucking scary card. Now, this is like the final scenarios in recognition hard mode, right? It's supposed to be scary. Now, that said, maybe this should still only be a 4-head test. 5 is a big number, man. I think because of some of the resource and card hate you see earlier in the scenarios, it sort of makes you think this is coming. From a meta perspective, you just know you want to bring more economy in your decks and more general question marks like Promise of Power for stuff like this. I think once you know this card is here, it's fine. It can be very rough on a blind playthrough, but I actually just think it's good. I don't even think it needs to be toned down to a 4. I think it's just good. Coming over to Invite Madness, we have a test 4 head. If you fail, choose 1. Shuffle a weakness in your discard pile into your deck, or discard cards on the top of your deck until a weakness is revealed, draw that weakness. I would like to see that second ability change to reveal cards on the top of your deck until a weakness is revealed, instead of discarding just, like, don't mill my deck for no reason. I've said this several times in the campaign, it's just anti-fun. I specifically had a play where I tried to use Cigarette Case and succeed at really high numbers to search for Savant so I could pass this test, and I failed. And then I took this test, but when I had searched for Cigarette Case, my top card was a weakness, and then when I actually took the test and failed, I discarded like 4 cards, all of which I really wanted before hitting a weakness. So like, this can result in situations where the players just aren't in control of what's happening. That's what happens with random discards. They're not fun, they don't really do anything if they're coming from the deck, so just don't do them. And our last encounter card, Beckoning Moon, Peril, test 5 anything. Surely you can manage this. If you fail until the end of the round, you may only move to locations that contain enemies. Completely fine with this. You're probably starting your turn where you want to be anyway. You're testing either Mythos stat, you should be able to do this. And there might be an enemy somewhere you can move to anyway. So like if it's just said you couldn't move, for like second to last and last scenario, test 5 head or foot, you can't move, I'm okay with that. This is a scary ass card and it should be, which is generally my opinion of that whole set. We're almost done. We just have the Hunters, their spoils, and the Milkweed Bosses. Let's start with the Milkweed Bosses. I think they're a little bit cooler. With the Milkweed Bosses, you get to see 2 different sets of them. There's one set that shows up in the later scenarios and one set that shows up in the earlier scenarios. Each set you see 2 times currently. I only fought 1 of each. No, that's not true. I got Yharnam as well. I fought the Bloodstarred Beast, Ludwig, and Yharnam. I haven't actually seen these others, so my feedback by them, or for them rather, is going to be more theoretical. Bloodstarred Beast is just sort of a tiny little guy, doesn't do much. He's 3/4/4, Hunter Alert. He spawns at location most humanoid enemies or furthest from you, and he'll eat humanoid enemies and get player scaling health, which is scary, but he only hits for 2/1, he has 3/4 base. Like, it seems pretty easy to just walk over and slap him to death, which, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. He's still making the scenario harder than it would be. He's not actually small, he's just small for an optional hard mode boss. Unlike Ludwig, Ludwig is fucking huge. Ludwig is a 4/3/4 retaliate massive. He gets 3 players scaling health. Then when you kill him, you give him a resource token, set his remaining health to 2 players, and he gets +1 damage and +1 horror. So he goes from hitting for 2 to hitting for 3/1. He's victory 3 for good reason. This guy's scary as hell. I know that in my playthrough, Parallel Skids just styled on this guy, just curb stomped him without any resistance. But that's what happens when you swing at like 11 after evading somebody, right? Like, My Parallel Skids deck wasn't entirely okay. This is a very scary boss, and it's exactly what I wanted to see out of the Milkweed stuff. Yharnam's a little bit weird. She's easy to hit, hard to trip, doesn't do very much, only has 7 health. If you use any event cards against her in any way, she removes them from the game. At the end of the round, if she's ready, she can't be unless you're not fighting her. I don't even know how she could be. You'd have to use like stealth, right? Because she spawns engaged with you if you exhaust her by evading her, or if she attacks you by not being evaded. Either way, she's exhausted. So this should just be at the end of the round, period. Otherwise, it just never goes off, ever. Anyway, theoretically, if this did go off, she would set all of her attachments aside, shuffle into the top 3 cards of the encounter deck, and she would spawn an enemy, a nightmare enemy from the deck in her location, which is pretty cool. But that's never going to happen. Anyway, every time you draw her, you get her health and other stuff back. But on the whole, she's just like a meat bag. It's easy enough to kill her, not really a problem. Lawrence also has Victory 3, and he seems to be hitting for 2-2. He's massive alert. Only 1 fist, but 5 players health, 6 foot. For every 3 levels of recognition recorded in the campaign log, Lawrence gets +1. Hold the fuck up. Hold the fuck. What? Hold the fuck. Okay, so I've just confirmed that you're not supposed to have 27 recognition. This guy has 10 fist. Okay, so that's obviously not okay. This needs to be at least for every 5 levels of recognition, or the speed at which you get recognition needs to be vastly slowed down. This has not been okay. That would have just, like, even Parallel Skids. I was like, look, he's got 11 fist. Ludwig doesn't stand a chance. 10 fist is enough. Nobody's killing a 10 fist, 5 players health enemy. That's not a thing. Hopefully you brought Occult Lexicon, but honestly, you don't have enough money to pay for it that many times. Hopefully you're specifically Harvey. This guy is a menace. He just scales too fast. If I drew this, I would have been like, look, we're gonna house roll that to every 5 levels of recognition because that's completely impossible. It would not be inaccurate to say that I'd expect somebody with a 4-player group to easily hit 35, 40 recognition. Like, yeah, a lot of it came from story events, but a lot of it just came from pulling insights out of the bag. And also, if you draw an insight against him, he gets +1 fight till the end of the round, who cares? I really like Lawrence. He's awesome, I love him. That needs to scale slower though. Greater Amygdala, the False God, 3/4/4 alert, massive, +2 players health. If it has 3 or less health, it attacks twice during the enemy phase. Oh, that's very scary. I like it. I really like that you can find yourself really thinking about how to secure the overkill. Because if you only just have a play to kill him, you might leave him at low health and then he just mauls you for 2-4. Like, if he's at 3 or less health, if he's in his frenzy state, then he's just going to hit you for, I don't know what to call it, ambivalent Carcosa Hastur damage, right? There's a version of Hastur that's not massive, that just hits 1 person, and he hits for 4 horror. This guy hits for that and 2 damage. I really like this. This is a really unique, scary enemy. Its foot's low enough that it can be evaded. You're drawing this in late scenarios. I really like Greater Amygdala. I've got nothing else to say about it. Now, getting back to the lower set, I already talked about Bloodstarved Beast. These are the ones you're seeing in earlier scenarios. I'm gonna start with Dark Beast Parle. The Storm of Bones is a wonderful subtitle. And while I'm here, The One Reborn doesn't have a subtitle. I don't know if that's like an intentional choice or if he doesn't have one, so I'm gonna make a note about it. So, I think Dark Beast Parle is overtuned. He has Victory 2, unlike the rest of these guys, so I understand that he's acknowledging that he is overtuned. But we're looking at 3/4/4, not really player scaling. 4/3/3, player scaling +1 health. I don't know how to change that. +1 means that this is just a 4. I understand that you're saying players +1 scaling health, but Abhorrent Beast isn't quite written in that way, and I don't know how to write it that way. So I would just give him health that is not that in a way that's easier to convey. Anyway, that's the amount of health here. The One Reborn is 3/3/3 with 2 player scaling health. This guy's 4/6/5 with 2 scaling health. He's 3 health up from the One Reborn. He's got the same fist number as Horrent Beast. He's got 1 higher foot than the Bloodstarved Beast. He's just literally the best stat from every one of these guys. This one's got Alert, this one's got Hunter, this one's got Hunter, none of Retaliate. This has all the keywords from them. Thankfully, he might not spawn with you because you need time to think about what the hell you do when he shows up. And also, while he's in play, every other beast deals 1 extra damage and he hits harder than anyone else. Bloodstarved Beast is the inverse, so I guess he's tied there. This guy's terrifying. If this guy were a 3/4, just these numbers flipped like this guy is, or a 4/4, making him like clearly the best where he's still better than any of these others, he'd be fine. At 5 foot, he's basically undodgeable. 4 fist is very high for this amount of health at the phase in the game where you're seeing him. Like in a 4-player game, this is a 14 health, 4/5 enemy that's just in the encounter deck. He's a little bit overtuned. He's really close to just being intentionally very scary, but I think he's a little bit overtuned. Anyway, going back to the other two, Abhorrent Beast, when you attack him, moves to a connecting location and exhausts. I really like that. I just love this card. It's really interesting. It makes the fight very weird. It's moving across the map. I really like this. Although One Sick Puppy is not really thematically consistent with the rest of these titles, so might need to change. The One Reborn is a 3/3/3 massive hunter spawn starting point. That should be starting location, not starting point. The phrase starting point is only really used to my memory in the Catacombs, and I know he's able to show up in the Catacombs-esque scenario, but in the Catacombs, your starting location is actually randomized, which is why it's remembered as the starting point. Whereas in the forest here, you always start at Odin Chapel, so it's the starting location. There's no text anywhere describing a starting point. It should just be starting location. If anyone engages with the One Reborn, remove all Doom from it at the end of the enemy phase. If it's ready and unengaged, put a Doom on it. It's super cultist. Of course it's super cultist. Why would it be anything else? I love the One Reborn. That's exactly what he should be. Thrilled about it. So yeah, that's the Milkweed bosses. We're almost done. Let's go through the hunters and their spoils. Anytime you have a scenario where you shuffle in hunters, you also put in 2 copies of the card Light Exchange. The first part of this is completely fine. You draw this, it's just more hunter density, right? Search the encounter deck and discard pile with an enemy with a Hunter of Yharnam trait, spawn and engage with you and shuffle the encounter deck. If you cannot, take 2 damage and this card gains Surge. So here's the issue, right? There's 2 of these, there's 1 hunter. You may well shuffle the encounter deck at some point during the scenario. This gives you several copies of take 2 damage Surge. No test, nothing. Just like, holy shit, that's one of the scariest cards I've ever seen. Let me tell you how overtuned I think this is. In my playthrough, I refused to play it this way. I just gave it Surge, I took off the 2 damage. 2 damage Surge is an insanely overtuned card, and I didn't feel the need to bother playtesting because I know that that just kills me. If people are playing this correctly and not dying to it, I'm very surprised to hear. This is absolutely wildly overtuned. Take 2 damage would be okay. Surge would be okay. Take 1 in Surge would be scary as hell, but okay. 2 in Surge is just ridiculous. I'm gonna quickly go through all the hunters. I'm probably going on hour 6 now, so I'm out of patience. I'm out of feedbacking. Let's go through them very quickly. I consider Vileblood Knight to just be like a sort of basic enemy that's hard to trip. Nothing really else about them. He's just a spoils enemy. Scourge Touched Hunter should also say starting location. As a 2/6/6, you don't trip him. He's just a meat sack you gotta churn through. And hitting for 2 damage, you do need to churn through it quickly, but he's not that scary. And in fact, in my opinion, across all of these, I'm gonna save us some time, is that they're basically reasonably large enemies that aren't that scary. There are a couple of hunters with like 5 fists that you could theoretically see very early, but they also have relatively low health. You should have ways to get through 5 fists in any fighting deck, especially in this campaign. None of the mechanics are particularly terrifying, but they all do have unique mechanics to them. None that are so interesting they'll bring attention to them, but they all feel like meaningfully different enemies, and they're nice ways to make the encounter decks a little bit spicier. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to the spoils in a campaign with so many good cards given to you by scenario rewards and story rewards, the spoils, in my opinion, are just universally pretty undertuned. These are, don't put these in your decks here, these are may as well, and this is, the story wants me to eat this eye, so damn it, put it in my deck. I mean, I may as well give up 2 actions and a resource and a card to get to experience, right? Now, in the may as well tier, we have a permanent card that completely fills the bag with curse tokens. This is a cost, by the way, so if you can't do that, if it has even a single curse token in the bag, you cannot use this. And in exchange, you teleport directly across the map. I would actually change this to have no cost. It does put 10 curses in the bag, but if you can't, and it's still filling the bag, it's still good enough. In addition, I would just say to any location. I don't see why it has to be a specific for this point. However, even though I think it's very, very hard to use and the cost of adding 10 is unnecessary, and it's specifically the furthest location, it's a permanent, so you may as well. Saw Hunter Badge is a next slot +1 fist that can ready an exhausted melee asset. But it's mostly that first half. Cyclopean Hammer synergy is funny though. But yeah, there are definitely characters that would use this, especially Guardians. Guardians are most frequently the character without a next slot, and they would love this. So Saw Hunter Badge is definitely a good item. But then we have 9 different flavors of suboptimal that shouldn't be in my deck. Let's start with Beast Embrace. This is what we call a crippling downside. You do not have hand slots. Not even you have 2 less, you straight up don't. You can't use Bandoliers, can't use anything like that. And in exchange, you can just always fight. Your basic fight action is now +1 damage. If this was a permanent card, because it gives you an additional action each turn, and now you're just fighting and you can't flex at all because you're getting the -2 malice to your other stats, I wouldn't mind. But because it's not a permanent card and I'm still running those hand slot assets to do my job, and then I draw this and I have to choose between them, I don't feel very good about Beast Embrace. I feel like there are better, easier ways to fight that don't come with as much opportunity cost, but it is definitely a very cool card. And unlike the rest of the cards in this group, I actually like that this exists in its current state, and you can absolutely build characters around using this instead of other weapons. Next, we have 4 cards that cost way too much for what they do. The Rose Marinus will slowly regenerate its ammo. It's a 6-cost double slot item in a hand and an arcane slot. It has 6 ammo, it gets 1 ammo per turn. You can spend 1 to 3, use Brain, get +X where X is the ammo. So this is a front-loaded recharging Brand of Cthugga, which is cool, but it also takes up an extra slot. And being front-loaded is a big deal. Brand of Cthugga has more charges than this, so the fact it's not getting them back is fine. And you get to use the charges after you succeed, so on the whole, this probably still has less. And Brand of Cthugga costs 2. And like anyone who's not using Brand of Cthugga doesn't want this. And everyone who wants this can use Brand of Cthugga, so I don't know what role it fills. Make Contact looks very good until you get to the last line. 5 cost arcane asset, 4 charges, spend a charge to investigate, head instead of book, +2. Discover up to 3 clues at this location, and then for each clue you discover, take 1 direct horror. This is just retiring the character with extra steps. No one can take 12 direct horror. Like, I mean that very literally, no one can. You have to heal to get through that. If it was just take 1 direct horror as a cost instead of for every clue, it would still be too much. I would just use the other arcane assets in my deck. Like, the direct horror cost just kills the card. The Whirligig Saw is actually one of the only cards in the set that just doesn't work. It commits for 3 fists, and that's the best use for it. It's a 5-cost hand asset that takes up 2 hand slots. When you fight, you reveal the top card of your deck, you get +X, where X is the resource cost of that card. The attack does +X divided by 2 damage, down to a minimum of 0, up to a maximum of +2. If you reveal a weakness, auto-fail and take 1 damage. No, you don't draw the weakness, so if you reveal a weakness, you literally cannot attack with this weapon this turn. And it takes up both of your hand slots. I didn't even realize that until just now, and I still thought the card didn't work. So, as a 5-cost card, your deck's economy is stressed because of this. You can't afford a bunch of other high-cost cards. So, like, if you're pulling skills, this is +0 for 1, you're using your fist. If you're pulling high-cost cards, your economy doesn't work. The card just doesn't fit into a deck where it does the stuff. And honestly, with what Whirligig Saw was in the game, I expected this just to, like, straight up say, fight +4 to fist, deal +2 damage, no additional text. Like, that would be an accurate representation of the Whirligig from the game. And I'm glad it's not that, but the really interesting thing they're trying to do here just sort of doesn't work, like, at all. When I was reading this card, the Evelyn, in my playthrough, I was like, why is it so bad? And then it clicked, and I was like, oh, it's a rogue card, now I understand. It's a 5-cost hand asset firearm with 3 shots. You can exhaust it and take a damage to get a bullet back. But, like, who's able to soak that much damage other than a rogue with a trench coat, right? And a tailor to fix it. Action, spend an ammo and exhaust it. Fight, you get +3 and deal +1. If you succeed by +2, you may heal a damage or ready Evelyn. So, like, yeah, it works in rogues, I guess. But +3 for 2 damage is, like, not actually that good, because auto-fail means that your weapon's exhausted and you can't keep fighting. Guns jamming just really sucks. It's the weakness of cards like the Mauser and the old hunting rifle. It's the weakness of this. Outside of a rogue, you're not playing this. But honestly, that puts it here. That puts it in the there is a home for this card set. Next, let's do a couple of cards where I'm just kind of confused who would want them. The Gold Ardeo is a slotless 2-cost asset that gives you +1 health, and you can use a lightning bolt to investigate with fist instead of a book. But if you do that, you can't tab fault or go on to fight in this round. Now, honestly, that's pretty cool. I love this card. I wouldn't put it in any deck ever, but I love this card. And the reason is because you have to consistently draw this to do it, meaning if your team needs this, you can't reliably do it, and if your team doesn't need this, you don't need this. So it fits into a bad slot, but what it's doing is super interesting, and unlike these other cards, I'm actually going to make more tiers. I think Beast and Gold Ardeo belong in a different group. These cards, I think, are genuinely bad and in need of reworks. These I would never put in decks. These have homes, and this is, like, non-applicable story asset card. Bone Marrow Ash underwhelms me. It's a 3-cost slotless asset with 1 supply that replenishes every time you defeat an enemy. Every time an enemy at your location is defeated, slightly more generous, but limit once per round. You can exhaust it and spend that 1 supply to get +1 to fight actions with firearms, and you may use your foot instead of fist until the end of the round. So that's a really cool effect if you need it. But like I just said with Gold Ardeo, if you need this, then yeah, it's awesome. But if you need this, you need it all the time. However, unlike Gold Ardeo, if you're running like a marksmanship deck, then Bone Marrow Ash fits in really well, gives you additional hits, makes everything fit more smoothly. I think there is a very tentative home for this. You can't really rework it very much other than making it a permanent, which would be crazy overpowered for just like a thing you randomly get. I don't feel comfortable putting it next to Gold Ardeo, because Gold Ardeo will get value if you put it in your deck, but I don't feel that way about Bone Marrow Ash. I feel like Bone Marrow Ash is just it's a card for an archetype, and just like Marksmanship, I think that's the name of the green asset, I'm not 100% sure. But just like that green asset that lets you do this, it's not good. You need it all the time, not some of the time. The Mensa's Cage is a 4-slot slotless asset, yet again, 3 charges, +1 head, -1 book. Or sorry, other way around, +1 book, -1 head. And when you would take Horror, you can exhaust this to test book 4 and spend a charge, only if you succeed. Then cancel up to X Horror, where X is the amount you succeed by. Much like Gold Ardeo, this is, not Gold Ardeo, oh, it's not here. The Queen's Stolen, or whatever it was. The story card from the 7th scenario, where it helps you deal with taking Horror. You should already have a solution. You can't rely on this. You should have it planned in your deck already. So this is slotless, +1 book, -1 head, to my opinion. And honestly, I just, like, at 4 costs, that's too much economy for me. I wouldn't ever run that. Threaded Cane looks like a level 0 rogue weapon, and if it was one, I still wouldn't run it. It fights at +1, letting you use foot instead of fist. If you succeed by 2 or more, exhaust Threaded Cane to draw a card, or to fight again at +3. If you succeed by 4 or more, do both. Neither of those unexhaust the card. This lets you draw twice to deal 2 damage, once per turn. Like, if your other hand is a real weapon, then cool, you can draw some cards off of this. But if your other hand would have killed them in 1 attack and this doesn't, then this card was useless. Because now you're spending a second action to draw a card, which you could have just done by drawing a card after you kill them with the other weapon. This is just like, it's a fighting card that doesn't fight good enough. And like, yeah, welcome to Rogue. An X card that doesn't X good enough is exactly what Rogue cards are, and it's why Threaded Cane is bad, is because it's modeled after real Rogue cards. But yeah, as a result, I don't think it's very good at all. Alright, I think I'm finally done. My Word document is 7 pages and 3,000 words long. I'm definitely going to send this to the creator as opposed to just sending a link to the video, because the video I assume is about 5 to 6 hours long. I'm going to edit it as aggressively as I can, and it's still going to be too long. And I'm probably going to take a break from YouTube for like a week, because it's just going to be a lot of work getting all of this edited. This was way more work than I expected it to be, but I'm glad I did it. Hopefully all of this can be used to help make the campaign better. And if nothing else, I hope all of you enjoyed watching me make this. I've been rather incoherent. This has been the Bloodborne fan campaign alpha test. I had a really good time. It was more work getting all the feedback than I thought it would be, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you sat with me through all of this, you're a fucking champion. You're a legend. I'm losing my mind over here. I am so many hours deep into this. I'm gonna call it now. I've been rather incoherent. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you stopped to get food at some point. If you didn't, you're starving, go eat something. I'm gonna do that myself. I'll see you in the next one.